The sky was covered with a dark curtain of smoke, and cries of panic filled the air, illuminated by flashes of fire. During the night, the Trivios Palace suddenly became engulfed in flames. Bright tongues of flame burst from the windows, casting light on the dark clouds. The barbaric tongues of flame devoured the decorative elements and antique furniture that had preserved the history of the majestic building for centuries. And near the entrance to the palace, the surviving maids and other court services sat with tears in their eyes. One of the maids looked at the burning building and thought that if she had only known that it would all end like this, she would have certainly escaped much earlier. The Trivios family is the living history of the Green Cirque Empire, but the mansion is so old that screams could be heard every time it collapsed. Two young men were watching a burning building, and one of them asked his partner not to let empathy push him to such nonsense. Screams did indeed come from the burning building, but there was still one servant left inside. Also, 3 maids remained alive, and the young men, looking at them, wondered what they would do with them next. One of the young men turned his head towards the girl, who was terribly scared and did not know what would happen to them next. The young man's gaze was so cold, as if he didn't care at all about the lives of the dying people in the palace. The strangers decided that they should not be seen by the maids, but the girls were incredibly scared. Agrian turned away from the maids so as not to see their tears, and tried to pull herself together and remain calm. 3 years have passed since the main character found herself in a novel called The Sun Spreading in the River. The Triviozzi house was ruled by a young man whom the heroine had seen in the palace more than once. In the Trivios family, she was relegated to the role of a servant, and Prince Wilhelm was recognized as a secret ally of the next ruler. To survive, she had to do whatever it took, and the backbreaking work eventually became second nature. There was one main problem. In 6 years, the Triviozzi family would fall. Prince Wilhelm's main enemy and the true hidden power of the Green Cirque Empire would also collapse, and Duke Licht Ingord would become the main instigator of all the horror that was happening. The heroine had absolutely no choice, so she was going to work for the Trivios family for 3 years and leave the capital, since she knew the future, and if it worked out, she could live in luxury, but not like now. However, since last year, events have begun to develop in a strange way. The Duke's daughter, who had not previously appeared in the novel, suddenly became the center of high society. And out of nowhere, from a distant village, a strange man appeared, predicting the future. At the same time, rumors began to circulate that Duke Wilhelm and Duke Licht had once quarreled over a particular woman. And it was then that the heroine finally realized that she was not the only girl in the novel, but there were other people. It seems they were planning to leave the duchy in 4 days, but unfortunately, the plans were not destined to come true. One of the young men insisted that he did not think that some maids doing menial work could foresee a well-thought-out plan, since everything was done by order of His Excellency. They were simply following orders given from above and were unlikely to do anything to hinder the plan. The heroine wanted to quietly leave the duchy with her close servants, but was unable to do anything before a terrible fire occurred. The maids were trembling with fear in front of the burning building, and each of them was incredibly scared. They were waiting for His Excellency to finally come and tell them what they should do next. A young man with blonde hair emerged from the burning building, and he seemed incredibly calm as the huge building behind him blazed with bright fire. But instead of His Excellency, the girls saw a completely different person, and now each of them became much more frightening. This young man with eyes the color of the sky turned out to be Licht Ingord, who should not have been here at all. Duke Licht Ingord was famous throughout the empire, and his cruel nature was the stuff of legends. He was the man who exterminated all the time travelers while a plan was being developed that would soon change everything. This man destroyed the heroine's hopes of using knowledge about the future and turned them into a futile delusion. He looked with particular pride at the blazing palace, at the once powerful ancient family of a huge empire which played a huge role in the life of society. Now, standing on the burnt ruins of the palace, he declared that the ancient family was incredibly disgusting in the tongues of burning flame. It was all complete madness, and just think how the heroine ever hoped to escape from such a cruel man. However, the heroine did not intend to die here because she had done nothing and had never tried to influence the world, unlike other time travelers, and moreover, had never looked down on anyone. All she had been doing was doing menial work for the Trivios family, but for some reason she now found herself cornered, and the young man who approached her asked her to raise her head and look him straight in the eyes. The Duke slowly approached the maid and looked closely at her face, as if the girl was already familiar to him. He ordered the killing of the two maids who were sitting on the left without thinking, and he never gave empty orders. The ladies began to scream loudly and beg for mercy, since they were innocent, but His Excellency's order was carried out unconditionally. And the very next second, the heroine saw how two friends were killed in cold blood right before her eyes, without even a chance for mercy. At that moment, the heroine felt herself overcome with hysterical laughter, because just yesterday, everything in her life was still fine. She bent over her murdered friends in horror, and the girl's entire body was shaking incredibly, and she only dreamed that she would die in advance during the terrible rebellion. The young man came closer and declared that she was the servant who had once wanted to brazenly run away from him. He stated that the lady was incredibly smart, but at the same time equally stupid, and in her place, he would have fled from the Triviasi family at midnight before the fire. The heroine couldn't even raise her head, let alone object to the young man, because there were definitely no such situations in the novel. The Duke continued to silently look at the girl, and with each passing second she became more and more frightened by the young man's intense, piercing gaze. He gently touched her face, from which drops of tears and blood were flowing, taking advantage of the fact that the girl was experiencing severe shock from what was happening. The Duke was so cold-blooded, and his face showed no emotion, as if he saw people die every day. He asked if the lady was worried about those maids, but this was just nonsense, because love and life are completely different things. The lady sat obediently on her knees and silently listened to the young gentleman, who still called her stupid. But were these the words she should have heard from the man who had just ruined her life and condemned her to eternal suffering? He grabbed her face with one hand and declared that he would give the girl a choice, and only she was honored with such an honor, because for him, human life was simply nothing. He suggested that the maid think carefully about what she wanted to choose, to live her miserable life under his control, or to die right here and now a miserable death, like her friends. A miserable life or a miserable death. And did he really offer the same choice to other time travelers? Or was it only the heroine who distinguished herself for him? She knew she couldn't think that she was different, because other time travelers who considered themselves special were mercilessly killed. And in this case, the heroine had only one way out. She asked to spare her, promising to become his devoted servant. The young man smiled silently and knew that the lady would agree to such conditions because she had no other choice. He called her a devoted little dog and thought it was incredibly funny until the girl could not breathe from the fear and horror of her new life. After this terrible dialogue, he asked the lady to stand up and asked the young man accompanying her to let her go. The heroine's legs were shaking with fear, and she barely stood up, seeing on the floor the bloody bodies of her friends, with whom she had laughed and talked just yesterday. She asked for forgiveness from the cheerful Cassie, who had a bright future, and also asked for forgiveness from Rona, who always wanted to have a big family and enjoy life. But only one remained alive. And even if she had to crawl at the feet of the villain, she would cling to life until the very end. A whole week passed after the terrible tragedy, but nothing happened to the heroine. She was a servant at Trivias, and remained a servant at Duke Ingord. At first it all seemed like a strange dream, but she felt that she was clearly out of place here. But in the end, it was just a passing whim. If she continued to remain here in the shadows, the Duke would surely soon forget about her, and choosing the right moment, she would finally be able to escape from here. This time she decided that she would run very far away, only without others, only she alone and her only life. She quietly went about her work with the maids, but one day someone called her a redhead, and at that moment the girl shuddered violently, because, as she thought, they were paying attention to her again. The butler loudly declared that from now on the girl would be called Susan, and in this palace that would be her new name. The young man said that when His Excellency asked her name, she would be obliged to answer the name Susan, and he did not intend to repeat it again. The girl silently listened to the master's order, who asked her to slowly follow him. She whispered the new name Susan, and knew that from now on she would be called exclusively by this name, and must forget about her own. Immediately after she had finished all her evening duties, she was taken somewhere without any explanation, and now her name was no longer Agrian but Susan. The young man led the girl to the right door and stated in a serious tone that she would need to go there. She was shaking, but she knew she shouldn't shake too much, because when you don't know for sure, even the craziest person can be kind to his servant. Susan pulled herself together and walked carefully into the dark room lit by only one candle. The Duke asked the girl to come and say hello, and surely she didn't want to do it first. The lady bowed her head low and greeted His Excellency, introducing herself as Lady Susan. As she entered the room, she smelled a strong smell of blood and asked if the venerable Duke had called her. There was a strong smell of blood in the room, and the maid did not understand why the young master had brought her here directly. He pointed to the corner of the room and asked the girl if she knew what it was. And as much as she wanted to pretend, she couldn't deny what she saw. Before her lay the dead young master, Triviach, whom she had served in the Trivia's house. It was a young gentleman, but the Duke thought that this was too kind an address to a rebel of a great empire who had committed many atrocities. Licht smiled when he saw the girl's emotions, but it wasn't just a smile. He was definitely planning something, holding out a sharp blade with a gilded handle in front of the girl. The young man said that he had had enough of the nagging, and that it was time for the girl to open the gift she had been waiting for so long. He asked the Union to take the steel sword into her fragile hands, and at that moment the girl was overcome by an incredible wave of horror and fear. After his words, the maid did not move from her place, and tried to understand why the young master with a smirk on his face was forcing her to do this. The Duke declared that since he was now the master, he must at least arrange a real holiday for her at least once in her life. He placed the sword in her hands and said that what had previously belonged to Triviasha was now the complete property of Duke Licht Ingord. The lady hesitantly picked up the sword, stating that she did not know how to use a bladed weapon and had never held a blade in her hands before. But in response to her words, the young man laughed maliciously, as if the girl's words were an incredible lie. He admitted that he is a very compassionate owner, especially when it comes to a beloved, loyal, and devoted dog like her. And now this cruel man wanted Susan to kill with her own hands the man she had served for 3 whole years and had seen alive. Of course, waiting had nothing to do with boredom, and the young Duke waited for the lady to make the first step and confidently take the sword in her hands. He brought her here, and now he's forcing her to kill a man, but on top of that, he's also intimidating her, and this young man really was crazy, and Susan couldn't get her strength together. The Duke leaned over to the girl and asked her to breathe evenly, because it was not her sword that was holding her, but she had rather gentle hands for a servant who had worked for 3 years. This means that at a young age she did not help with the housework. And is she really not an ordinary commoner? The Trivias family was not very picky about the background of its employees, so it is likely that Susan learned the language from other maids. She was recorded as if a maid had fallen from the sky, and there is no news or information about his family. The ruthless Duke held the girl by the shoulders while she held a huge sword in her hands, and the corpse of her previous master lay on the floor. The Duke just smiled and said, "This is the most interesting part of getting to know each other, which everyone must go through." But the maid could not allow him to play with her any longer, fearing that she would actually have to kill him. The young gentleman was so sweet from birth, he always turned a blind eye to minor mistakes. Susan knew she was ready to crawl on the floor or even lick boots if she had to. But she didn't want to lose her humanity. She turned to His Excellency, and he was surprised, because before this the girl had not uttered a word. But now she was about to say something. Susan tried to stay calm, to remain the sweet little dog he so wanted to see. After all, she knew that in this cruel game, she would have to survive by any means necessary, no matter what. She asked the young Duke if the man lying on the floor was already dead, since he was covered in blood and had not moved for a long time. The Duke's assistant approached the bloody youth and checked his heartbeat and pulse, making his final verdict. Susan was indeed right. The young master had died long ago from massive blood loss, and he was indeed dead now. And it seems the Duke missed something important. If he had been useful even after his death, he would not have been Wilhelm's watchdog. The lady continued to keep her composure and silently looked at the dead young gentleman while the Duke kept his gaze fixed on her. He asked whether, during their conversation, the girl had managed to understand whether he was alive or dead. The Duke warned that Susan would receive a task from him a little later, and until then she was obliged to sit quietly and not stick her head out anywhere, not showing how bad or in pain she was. Even though this was their second meeting, only Susan knew for sure and was absolutely sure of it. Licht Ingord was extremely insane and cruel towards any person or living creature, regardless of age, gender, or nationality. The young man who was the third in the room confidently declared, "The lady is very perceptive, but equally very stupid. And she must know that there is absolutely nothing good in the fact that she has attracted the attention of His Excellency, and a very difficult fate awaits her. She wishes someone had told her about it earlier, because perhaps she would have changed her choice between life and death in that situation." The young man admitted that he immediately wanted to tell the girl that everything that was being done was solely for her benefit and nothing else. The lady must throw all thoughts of escape out of her head, because in any case she will not succeed, at least so that she would not be placed in the coffin in pieces. And this depends only on the young lady and on her exemplary behavior in front of the young duke. His Excellency is truly cruel when he starts hunting someone, so you shouldn't hinder him or try to stop him from doing something. The first night after the tragic incident was incredibly difficult for the girl, and every second she tried to throw thoughts of escape out of her head. Birkne Milent has been working for Duke Licht for a long time, and he is reserved in both his expressions and words. Compared to the cruel Duke, he seems more humane, and would probably be a good person if not for his service to the Duke. Susan remembered him from the fire, when he was talking to the red-haired knight while the building burned behind them. It was unclear how Birkne and the Duke knew about her planned escape with the maids, and whether they had sent someone in advance. Now, of course, was no time to find fault with his submissiveness to his master, or wonder whether those words were really advice, and it didn't look like she would be able to find common ground with him. She decided that she should just wait for a better moment, and whether he would trust her if she pretended to be faithful until the grave. She had only one chance. All she had to do was wait until he finally let his guard down. Agrienne, lying in a cold bed in a dark room, tried to give herself strength, because she must do as her heart tells her. And unfortunately, she had no other way out, having found herself in a cruel situation with the Duke. The next morning, the maids were busy with work, and Susan was with them in the palace. She silently carried out each order, but suddenly one of the young men called her by name, and the lady next to her trembled in surprise. The young man slowly opened the door, and it became obvious that he had some business with the girl. The heroine asked what happened, but the young man was not very talkative and simply remained silent. She looked into his eyes, but he still had not said a word, and the lady was overcome with terrible doubts. Suddenly, he asked her to follow him down the dark corridor of the eerie basement, lit only by dim lights. The young man admitted that he did not think that in the current situation, the Duke could give Susan any assignment, and she would be able to do something. But the lady first of all felt the disgusting smell coming from the basement. Susan was overcome with fear and horror as she entered the dark, deathly silent basement. This could not be, but she supposed that it was not the real deal, for it was not the young Master Triviacci, but the young man who had entered with her, who had invited the girl to touch it and see for herself. He specifically offered to come up and check if the lady was so interested, although he himself understood that she would not be able to do this under any circumstances. He admitted that he didn't really want to waste time on the maid, so she would have to come and see for herself anyway. The lady trembled and asked to at least be told what exactly she needed to do before the young man dragged her to the body himself. And does she really think that he would entrust something important to a person who only knows how to clean and cook? Susan looked closely at the body from afar, and judging by the height and hair color, it was definitely not young Mr. Triviatz. She carefully approached the young man lying on the table, and the young gentleman kept a close eye on her gestures and behavior the whole time. The sharp blade of a knife flashed in his hands, and Susan held her breath at that moment, waiting to see what would happen next. Killing is easier than you think, and most people lose their vigilance at such moments. Special training or skills are not needed at all. You just need to wait until the enemy is caught off guard, and only then can a person survive from an attacker. He handed the knife into the girl's hands. She took the handle with trembling hands and came closer to the body. The lady clearly expected this. Everything happened too suddenly in a very short period of time in a new place. The Duke held the girl by the shoulder as she, clutching the handle of the knife, bent over the body of the dead man. There was no place for useless people near His Excellency, and Susan had to prove that she was worthy of staying in this place and being alive. And only now did she realize that her usefulness lay in killing people, and the cruel Duke had chosen her for precisely this purpose. The young man stated that Lydia was definitely different, because if she were an ordinary person, the young master would have taken her life long ago, right next to the burning building. No matter what he thought about it, there was one thing he couldn't understand: why His Excellency would bring someone like her into his house. And to be honest, the girl is more interested in this than anyone else, because she was the only survivor of that terrible tragedy. In any case, His Excellency entrusted Susan to his partner, so he will do everything in his power, including keeping her alive. And does she really think that the Triviuses will disappear on their own? The girl's heart was pounding wildly in her chest, and she didn't know what to say, expecting to be lost, but not to disappear, or not expecting such an outcome at all. Looking at the maid, the young master only laughed quietly, realizing how scared the girl was now. The young man smiled and said that he had completely forgotten, and the young girl probably had not thought about it at all. No one knew what the maid might be thinking, but the maid knew she had screwed up, and she shouldn't show that she was so nervous. He was going to teach her how to hit vital places, and warned her to remember it right away, because he wouldn't repeat it several times. The maids were asking each other where the new girl Susan was, since she never showed up for dinner. One of the girls said that Susan was not feeling well, so the head maid allowed her to finish early and go to rest. But today she was incredibly pale, and she needed a good rest. And while everyone was wondering where the new maid was, she went to the court garden to get some fresh air and finally come to her senses after everything that had happened. No matter how hard she tried to wash her hands, the smell of blood would not leave her palms, as if it had been ingrained into the skin. The smell was terrible and unmistakable, the smell of death, fear, and the stinking smell of pain. She had already been turned inside out several times by what she had seen, and for the heroine, it was very disgusting, because her life had been turned upside down. She tried to wash her hands in the river water, but suddenly she saw a black animal running nearby. Turning around, she saw a huge black wolf with a black rag in its teeth and its yellow eyes sparkling with anger and horror. The predatory wolf suddenly pulled off her bandage and rushed forward, while the girl screamed in horror. She knew that she would not be able to catch up with the predatory forest beast, but still, in its teeth was part of her clothing. Misfortune seemed to follow Susan at every turn, and it was completely unclear why this wolf appeared at this particular moment and stole her bandage. Perhaps the hairband had saturated the kitchen with its smell, and so he assumed it was just a piece of meat. But at all costs, the maids had to find her, because she had nothing else to put her hair up with. The lady caught a glimpse of the direction the predatory animal was heading, and, without thinking, ran after him, hoping that he would leave her bandage somewhere along the way. As the lady ran without looking back, she stopped and realized that she did not recognize the area at all and did not understand where she was at all. And if she went even deeper into the forest, some kind of trouble would definitely happen, so the Alliance immediately needed to return back before she got completely lost in the forest. But suddenly, a thought flashed through her head that if she suddenly continued to go deeper, she would be able to get out of here and finally escape from the cold-blooded Duke Ingord. Oddly enough, as she ran, her head became clear, and if she continued to run without stopping for a second, perhaps success awaited her. And perhaps she will be able to gather herself so far away that the Duke will never find her and never remember her again. While the girl was running headlong, she did not feel any pain in her legs or her labored breathing. But to her surprise, she saw the Duke ahead with the dead wolf in his hands, and her plan failed again. The young man held the dead predatory animal in one hand and looked at the girl with cold blood, realizing that she was trying to escape. Her heart was pounding in her chest, but she stopped and stared at the Duke, who was looking straight at her. The Duke stated that the predatory beast ran around the forest as if unconscious, around and around, so it was easy to catch it. He symbolically threw the dead animal in front of her, as if hinting that exactly the same thing could happen to the girl. Susan watched as the life instantly left the body of the dead animal, and right in front of her it breathed its last. And all this time he was really running away from the cold-blooded man, but still, the Duke, following the wolf's trail, mercilessly killed him. It seems that the lady on the ferry momentarily completely lost her head. She apologized to the gentleman and said that this wolf took one very important thing from her. Licht smiled and said, "Why apologize? Is there anything wrong with returning something that belonged to you?" His hand in a black glove touched the girl's face, who was so terrified that she couldn't even blink or move. The lady sat on her knees. But all this time, she incredibly wanted to hide somewhere from his piercing gaze and never feel it again. The young man said that if you go further into the forest, you will come across a swamp, or one so thick that even the sun's rays do not penetrate it. But if you walk for 3 days without stopping, you can reach the meadows, and immediately beyond them is the county of Jorah. Susan knew there was nothing to do there anyway, but she didn't understand why he was so kindly telling her all the details. It seemed to her that no matter how hard she tried, the girl would never get out of here. From the outside, it must have looked ridiculous, but given her situation, she used every opportunity to avoid a terrible fate. Susan rose silently from her knees and looked at the Duke, and he had an incredibly contented and happy expression on his face. She asked, it seemed the young gentleman was hunting here, and their meeting was a complete coincidence. She carefully took her handkerchief in her hand and wiped away the beads of sweat on the young Duke's face. And it seemed that he did not resist her touch at all. The sun was already setting, and the lady said that she needed to return quickly. Otherwise, twilight would fall on the forest, and she would not be able to see anything in the darkness. The lady understood perfectly well that it was dangerous to be alone with Licht, so she said that they could see each other at the mansion and wished the young man a safe journey. But suddenly, the young gentleman picked up the lady in his arms, not giving her a chance to escape from his strong embrace. Licht admitted why the girls should go alone when they can go together, since they are definitely going in the same direction, and it is unlikely that they should separate now. The lady understood that this was his cunning trick. In fact, he did not want to let her go alone, because at any moment the girl could try to escape again. He carried her in his arms to his horse. Susan did not even resist or struggle, realizing that it was useless. Licht carefully sat the girl in the saddle, and she did not understand what was happening to him, because his actions were rather strange. And was this really how he decided to take care of her bare feet, on which huge abrasions and bruises were visible? The lady sat in front and felt his warm breath and his gaze on her neck. He asked her to remember one thing. Susan was not a stray wolf without an owner, and should behave appropriately. Together they reached the palace, and the maid went to do important things. She wondered if the Duke had any more book business because he was acting very strange today. He didn't ask her to follow him or even hint at it, but she, without realizing it, followed him into his office. And it seemed that she understood his intention without words, and felt a strange feeling as if he was gradually taming a wild forest animal. Licht walked over to one of the cabinets, which was always locked while the maid stood meekly nearby. The girl watched carefully what he was doing, and the young man took out a test tube with some liquid from the farthest shelf. He handed the test tube to the girl and asked her to visit him over the next 3 days, and she must carry out this order unconditionally. The Duke declared that he would give the girl this poison, and she must take it every day without question. The concentration of the poison was quite low, so it would take some time for it to take effect. But once Susan's body got used to it, it would become resistant to most poisons, and that was its main secret. The girl carefully held a test tube with red poison in her hands, but she knew that Duke Licht was definitely crazy, or insane. He really turned out to be a real madman, but it is not at all clear what he was going to do next with the innocent maid. He ordered her to drink the poison exactly once a day at the same time, and not to miss a single day. And she can have it in any quantity, if she is confident enough in herself and her abilities. Licht smiled and said that the girl's face now really did look scared, although before she had been holding on steadfastly. Obviously, the young man had calculated everything long ago and was behaving this way deliberately, so the lady needed to pull herself together and pull herself together without showing a drop of excitement. She remembered the wolf he had hunted, and he had clearly made it clear that she could repeat the fate of the unfortunate beast. The lady asked how long he would have to take the poison, but the young man himself did not know too few had gone through something like this for him to be able to give an exact answer about the effect of the poison on the body. Susan wondered what the chances were that among those few, there were dead girls who also drank poison, but she did not express her doubts to the young master, but only said that she would obediently carry out his order. The lady stood silently to the side while the young man took the piece of paper and finally stopped paying attention to her. He asked if the maid had anything else to say, or if she had understood all the conditions. Susan bowed low and said that she would see the master again tomorrow, following his order. As soon as Lita was about to leave, Licht suddenly asked her when she thought his duchy would go. The lady looked in his direction in surprise and did not understand why Licht suddenly decided to ask her about this. At the time she was fascinated by the novel The Sun Spreading in the River, it was still far from being completed. But it was already clear for sure that the main character of the novel was Prince Wilhelm, and the main villain, in turn, was easy to guess in the person of Licht. Now the lady almost made a fatal mistake, and almost answered him that he was just a consumable, serving the development of the protagonist, and she wondered if he asked this question to other time travelers before their deaths. But Susan knew she had to say something now, because silence would also seem strange. The heroine replied that she couldn't know for sure, but as long as the gentleman was here, nothing terrible should happen. She saw that Licht didn't react to her words in any way, but it felt like he was afraid of something. The young man began to carefully examine the important papers, never raising his head to the young lady after the question was asked. She apologized and left the office, and it seemed like the most tense meeting she had had with anyone in years. Today, Licht Ingord seemed suspiciously normal for a madman like him. It was as if the person speaking to her today was not the same one who had asked her to kill the master a few days ago. However, his question sounded too strange, and he probably assumed that his duchy would soon go. The lady was still standing near the office door, trying to forget this conversation, holding a strange bottle with red contents in her hands. And this duke did not give her a moment's peace, as if he really needed this girl. The next morning, the maids were busy cleaning the main room, and they did a great job today. Now it was finally possible to relax and breathe a sigh of relief, because the most important tasks from early morning had already been completed. They turned to Susan and asked her to remember to rest as well, since the lady had worked tirelessly with them. Most of the work had already been done, and the lady hoped that after drinking the poison, everything would be fine. But she did not know how to tell the maids if she felt ill after taking the poison. One of the maids was hanging out laundry outside and suddenly turned to Susan, who was also doing laundry. The lady noticed that the girl suddenly turned pale because in the morning her face looked completely healthy. She saw that the lady seemed to be working more slowly, so she asked her not to overexert herself because she really did look very sick. Susan thanked Raina for her pleasant concern, and she really didn't feel very well. All the people of Ingord were incredibly friendly and warm, and it was just a wonderful environment, except for the crazy duke. The next day, the lady again found herself next to a dead man, who was lying covered in blood with a bag over his head, and in the girl's hands was a sharp dagger. The heroine thought that she would have time to get used to this idea, but she never expected that she would have to deal with this just a day later. She didn't understand where all these corpses were coming from, and why she had to take part in it. She had never seen any of them within the walls of the mansion before, and so she couldn't help but feel guilty. She was only following someone else's orders, but she was still a participant in terrible events. Suddenly, the young man asked how much the girl knew about Ingord and its inhabitants. Susan admitted that she doesn't understand politics, and all she knows is that the Duke is a very influential man. From the very foundation of the Grindferk Empire until now, all state affairs have revolved exclusively around the ruling family. But it was not always so, but until the death of His Majesty, the now deceased emperor. The young man wondered if there was another man in the state who had power equal to the emperor. As Susan thought, what degree of danger would that man be in from close attention? And as Susan understood, the target was the venerable Duke himself, who had the greatest influence in the empire. All these people they are watching are real spies who are ready to destroy the Duke at any second. It seems that everything he said earlier was referring to none other than Duke Licht, since he was referring to the innocent corpse when he spoke of it. The lady seriously wondered if that meant they had the right not to feel guilty for killing people, and if the girls felt better that way, then she could think so. But she never received either a negative or a positive answer, and yet, now she felt less cruel. The young man suggested that it would probably be worth practicing on animal corpses, since they were most likely present here as well. Animal vital organs are essentially no different from human ones, only knowing the right angle to attack. She turned to Birkney and said that she felt that their training was not effective enough, and apparently he was not the type to talk. Bernie asked if the girl really wanted him to bring her a living person, but she was surprised that he could calmly say such terrible things. He asked the girl to be silent, because in any case, today was the last day of practice, and this news surprised the lady very much. He gave her the bare minimum of information, but holding a sharp knife in her hands, Susan became downright scared. As far as the young man already knew, His Excellency gave the girl a glass bottle with a special liquid. And if this is really so, then from tomorrow onwards, obviously, he will be observing his own body and not someone else's. Susan seemed to understand everything, and by this he meant to say about the poison, but after drinking the poison, everything was fine with her, except for a slight chill. Several hours passed, and the girl realized how serious a situation she had gotten herself into after drinking an unknown poison, because at that moment, her nose started bleeding heavily. It took her only 3 hours to realize how wrong she was, and the maid, seeing streams of blood pouring from the girl's nose, was frightened of what was happening to her. Susan insisted that she was not worried about being sick, and that the disease was simply hereditary, and that in a few days she would definitely feel better. The lady came closer and admitted that she should talk to the head maid, and the girl needed to go to the doctor, because she was looking paler with each passing minute. Kind Rena would probably have cried right then and there if Susan had admitted that they weren't going to see a doctor. She promised to go to a doctor and then try to rest. But when she saw herself in the mirror, she realized that she looked no better than the corpses that she had recently tormented. And it was impossible to express in words all the pain that the girl experienced when she found herself in this terrible story. She had strange sensations in her body, as if the blood was literally freezing in her veins, and her body was slowly dying, although it was still breathing. But instead of blood, poison was flowing through her veins, and it was bringing unbearable, painful torment. Berkney was right. There was no point in placing much hope in the painkiller, and this would continue until all the blood was saturated with poisonous toxins. And perhaps it is better to immediately abandon hope that the painkiller will work, and rather pray to heaven for a speedy improvement in your health, and this will be more practical. The girl incredibly wanted to go up to the Duke, grab him by the shoulders, and scream that she promised to do whatever he wanted. But why was he trying to turn her into living poison? Because a lot of time had already passed, and the end of the torment still had not come. Every day she felt worse. Everything became blurry before her eyes, and awareness and feeling floated further and further away, until Susan no longer felt anything at all. When the Duke realized that the girl was really very ill, he took her by the waist and called her by name when she was already completely unconscious. He asked her to open her mouth if she wanted the painful torment to end and she would feel good. Because of the intense heat, the girl could not see anything at all and did not even understand who was in front of her. But the Duke held her tightly by the waist and asked her to open her mouth, after which she would definitely feel much better. He asked her not to miss a single drop and to swallow all the liquid that seemed to be in her mouth. At first, Susan felt hot sensations throughout her body, but then these sensations became colder and colder. She was still without strength, and the young Duke held her by the waist and waited for the antidote to take effect, and the girl to at least come to her senses a little. The pain really did begin to subside little by little, and there was a strong smell of fresh blood all around. Licht carefully laid the girl on the bed, but her body still couldn't move, and her eyes were closed and trembling. Susan was so confused about what was happening that she couldn't even understand who came up to her and helped her lie down on the bed, because that night everything seemed like a terrible nightmare to her. The next morning, the girl got out of bed on her own and looked out the window when it was already early morning. In the novel The Sun Spreading in the River, the plot line developed very slowly. Despite its slow pace, this novel could make Susan eagerly await what would happen next, and she reread it so often that she even remembered the storylines of the secondary characters. Obviously, the role of the most popular character among readers was assigned to the main character, Prince Wilhelm. The author's entire attention was focused on the prince's personal affairs, and at some point it even became tiresome, because despite his origins, the young man always strove to grow to the top of the world, driven by love for the only lady of his heart. But he was separated from this girl in childhood, and the Prince of the Empire was constantly looking for his sister. Such attention is, of course, not surprising, but it was impossible not to hate him for it. But also behind the scenes remained his worst enemy, Duke Licht, and even when the novel reaches its climax, Licht's past is still shrouded in a dark secret. Some details of the story shed light only on the bottom. The Duke thirsts for retribution, and his blade is aimed at the imperial family, but all the lady knows about the future is at best the next 3 years. During this time, the heroine needs to know the truth about the Duke and the Prince, otherwise the lack of information could cost her life. But even so, there was no guarantee that she would survive, so the girl was completely confused. The next morning, Raina approached Susan again, stating that her face was white as a sheet again and that the girl was probably exhausted. The lady smiled and said that this was definitely out of the question, because today she was much better than she had been yesterday. But Raina still insisted that no matter how you looked at it, the maid looked like a real walking corpse. No matter how much Susan tried to convince her, she herself could see perfectly well that her appearance was bad, and she looked more tired than usual. Anyway, she is definitely feeling better today, and it's all thanks to that strange incident in the morning. After she swallowed an unknown liquid, she felt much better, but she didn't know what it could be. Susan asked Raina to imagine that at dawn, when it was still pitch dark, a man came into her room. Susan claimed that this man gives you something to drink, and after that, the strange illness that seemed to never leave you goes away upon awakening. Raina only responded to this by saying that she could think about it, since it all seemed like a strange delusion. The maid smiled and said that perhaps this was a dream that promised good luck, and perhaps it meant that the illness that was tormenting her would soon pass. In truth, Susan was not interested in the interpretation of the dream, but in this stranger, Raina assumed that perhaps he felt sorry for the girl, and that is why he came to give her medicine. And he came precisely under cover of night, in order to keep his identity a secret. And perhaps he does have some sympathy for Susan. Although he didn't want to hide from the girl who he was, even on the border between reality and sleep, she felt something. She clearly felt that it was Duke Licht, because his aura was completely unmistakable. This man only spared her life because she could entertain him, but why on earth would he come to her in the middle of the night? Raina admitted that it would have been much more creepy if it hadn't been a dream, so she was sure that the lady had let go precisely because of this mysterious stranger. And did it really matter? And Susan laughed. It was more important than the not-so-comfortable bed she had to sleep on. Raina laughed. If the young man interested her so much, why shouldn't she ask him herself when they would see each other again, and try to ask the heavens for pepper in her sleep for a new meeting with him? Raina thought it was strange that the only person she served was the Duke. But there was always a ton of work to do, and it was a good thing that the ladies had already finished by midday. From today onwards, he and Marie, by order of the Duke, must help with cleaning the outbuilding. The girls stopped near the window, and Raina admitted that it seemed the outbuilding was on that side, and Susan had never been there before. A whole month has passed since Susan started serving here, but she has never actually been there. But she seems to have heard something about this place. There were rumors that someone lived there, a young woman about the same age as her. They say she is the daughter of an aristocrat, and at first everyone thought that she was installing a new duchess, but they did not pay her due attention, and she stayed here of her own free will, and His Excellency did not drive her away. The Duke and the lady from the wing are so perfect that it seems nothing can diminish their dignity. And if you believe the rumors, the discord between the Duke and the Prince happened because of a woman, and perhaps this is not so far from the truth. Does this mean that the Duke, like everyone else, can also fall in love with someone? And this is that very girl. Now Susan became more and more interested in finding out who was in the back room and what kind of lady she was. While the maids were busy with their work, passing by a crowd of young men, she noticed a red-haired young man. It seemed that his face was painfully familiar to her, and she was definitely not seeing it for the first time. It was the same night she had met before, but she could not remember all the circumstances of their first meeting. That day, in the Trivias mansion, he grabbed the girl by the hand and led her out of the fire to save her from certain death. Then he asked who the maids were next to her, and whether she wanted to drag anyone else along with her, but it would be better for her to forget about her friends and leave them to burn alive. Susan definitely remembered. It was the same man, and she was absolutely sure of it. The pain in her jaw that he had left her with for disobeying her was still there, and she didn't want to run into that boy again. The lady went to her room, but suddenly heard Berkney's voice asking where Susan was. Entering the room, he admitted that the girl looked much better, and had he really been worried about her all this time? And even if that wasn't the case, it seemed that Susan was beginning to trust him, because he had been kind to her in his own way, and perhaps if she told him what had happened last night, he would help her somehow. Berkney noticed that the lady was still tense, but was now more or less in order. He asked you to try to maintain the same cheerfulness in front of the Duke and follow him. In other words, Susan was not allowed to show that she was experiencing terrible pain or distress. The young man asked to listen to his advice, since it was in the lady's interest to stay as far away as possible and not to express pain, but the lady knew, since the Duke himself gave her this poison. He warned that this was no joke, and the maid did not know what was in the bottles the Duke gave her, so she had to be extremely careful. He may not look it, but he is not one to revel in the suffering of his vassals, and if the lady feels she is unable to cope with the poison, she should seek help, and he will generously provide a painkiller. Susan was sure that the remedy would hardly help her, but she had no other options but to follow her master's orders. She followed Berkney slowly as he silently made his way towards the Duke's office. He admitted that His Excellency could actually be quite sympathetic, but he simply sometimes lacked the courtesy to condescend to explain. The young man asked the lady not to think too badly of him, but it seemed as if he had confused him with someone else. I myself witnessed how the Duke literally hacked one gentleman to pieces, and how, after what he saw, he could say such things. He also asked the girl to be careful that His Excellency did not explain anything and did not give specific advice or answers to questions. At the very least, Susan should think twice before making any decisions, because behind every sweet speech there may be a deadly poison. Susan realized that she shouldn't think badly of the Duke, but at the same time she had to be careful and not make decisions in the moment, so as not to regret it for the rest of her life. Entering the office, Berkney announced that he had brought a maid, as the master had requested earlier. His office was completely dark, and only dim rays of light illuminated his pale face. He looked at the girl with a cold-blooded gaze, and it seemed that his face was completely incapable of expressing any emotions. Oddly enough, when looking at him, the girl was visited by a familiar feeling, as if she had felt it before. And could it really be that the mysterious man who came to her in the darkness was the Duke himself? The young man smiled a barely noticeable smile and said that he had one very important thing for the girl, and she shouldn't be distracted. And it was time to again take on the role of an obedient dog that runs to him at every call. The matter may seem at once simple and complex, and Susan was to accompany the gentleman to the banquet and become his lady-in-waiting for the day. It turned out that she needed to pretend to be an aristocrat, and what's more, go with the Duke to an important celebration. Perhaps this was some kind of test, and Susan asked if she needed to pretend to be a specific person. Licht stated that there was no point in it anyway, and she would simply have to follow his orders. But at that moment, the windows of the Duke's main office were illuminated by a bright burning flame, and it became clear that something had happened outside the palace. The Duke turned around and saw the nearest building, the outbuilding in which the girl, unknown to everyone, was located, burning. Not a muscle moved on the young man's face, and he continued to look calmly at the burning building. The Duke said he would handle everything himself, and Berkney was not too soft for this matter. For some reason, Licht was not at all surprised, as if he had been expecting something like this for a long time. The young people were not at all tense, but excitedly followed them with their union. The knights and maids ran out of the palace shouting that water was needed because the fire was spreading further. He asked to call Mr. Keene, and no one believed that he could allow such a thing because it wasn't even funny. The knights apologized to the Lord, but he also continued to look at the burning building with cold blood. He had no time for empty talk, and now he was trying to figure out whose fault it was, and the red-haired boy said it was entirely his fault. But no one was allowed to make such mistakes, and the Duke immediately took out a sharp blade and was going to punish all the culprits right on the spot. And the excited Susan could not believe her eyes that in 1 minute a terrible tragedy had occurred that no one expected. He killed the knight standing next to him in cold blood, but not the red-haired youth who admitted his mistake. He warned that he had already told them several times that they should not interfere in matters that were none of their business, because anyone would be severely punished. Licht warned he hated to repeat himself, but it also turned out to be useless, and it was not for him to teach the knights henchmen who should do their duty properly. He asked Berkney to transfer Ariel Kreutz to the main building and promised to entrust the rest to the butler. All this time, Susan stood with a frightened face, and for the first time she heard the name Ariel Kreutz. She was Prince William's right hand, an incomparable marchioness, and was considered to be more devoted to the prince than anyone else. But the Duke had just mentioned his name, which meant that the guests were of the same family. But that was definitely not the case in the novel, and Susan now had absolutely no idea what was going on. No matter how hard Susan tried to remember, there was definitely nothing like that in the original, and Lady Kreutz could not have stayed with Ingord. Suddenly, one of the maids screamed, "The Marquis is hiding right now is here." The young man smiled as soon as Ariel was in danger, and Wilhelm's faithful dog appeared to him personally in a timely manner. The atmosphere around was exactly the same as it had been then, a scorching light black smoke and the smell of fresh blood, and at the head of all this chaos stood the figure of Duke Licht Ingord. Just like when Susan had begged him for mercy in front of the burning Trivias mansion, it was as if it were happening all over again. The name of the Kreutz family was unknown to the young lady, and she did not even know what to say. It was obvious that this was a very influential family, and she had nothing more to add on the matter. Susan admitted that she didn't want to lie to the gentleman about something she didn't understand, because she really had never heard that name before. Licht smiled and said that he understood the young lady perfectly well, and if she said so, then it really was so. He asked to accompany the Marchioness to the reception room, and was interested as if Susan should know better than he what was happening now. Susan caught that intense gaze again, as if the young man was deliberately expecting something from her, and she was not telling him everything. The situation required quick action, so Burns suggested talking later about what they had discussed with the gentleman, but Susan had already said that she didn't know anything, but the more she thought about it, the less she understood. Now was clearly not the best time to discuss the situation with the girl that happened last night. There is absolutely no connection between her and the Kreutz family, and let it remain so. Unlike other time travelers, Susan will not be killed by the Duke, and this was the only good news so far. The next night, voices were heard near the palace, asking whether all the business was finished, and the knights carefully examined the surroundings. Until last night, Susan felt almost fine, but everything had already changed dramatically. The maid stood by her bed and discussed. They were very sorry. But if this continued, they were not sure that Ingord's work would be suitable for the young lady. But here the main word was only with the master, and none of the maids could make an important decision. He himself wanted her to work for him, and he has good reasons for this. That night, Susan's pain became completely unbearable, and she prayed that the mysterious man would come to her at least once more at dawn and help her ease the severe pain. A few days later, Susan woke up and got out of bed, surprised that she had slept for 2 whole days. While she was sleeping, there was real chaos around, and no one could say when and how it would all end, and so 4 days slowly passed, and Susan believed that it should get easier. She asked if she had really missed anything important, and the lady reminded her of the lady who lived in the outbuilding. It turned out that she was the daughter of the famous Marquis of Kreutz, and that she was of high birth was immediately obvious. And the funniest thing is that this only became clear thanks to Marquis Kreutz, who so suddenly paid a visit to Ingord. One of the maids asked the lady to watch her tongue, because high society gossip had nothing to do with them, and who cares what maids talk about at dinner anyway? The Duke's troops have been fighting with Wilhelm's troops all this time, and it is possible that Ariel is being held here for political purposes. But one thing is not clear: is Lady Kreutz really that valuable? Or is this also a setup by those close to the prince himself? But be that as it may, for Licht, Wilhelm's very existence is like fuel for the fire. And compared to how it was described in the book, the full intensity of passions is felt here more acutely. Susan became friends with Reyna, and all this time the girl took care of her health. But for several days, she has been tidying up the outbuilding, so she is extremely busy. The heroine was incredibly happy that she found a person with whom she became close, and if you think about it, they even had similar characters. The Duke asked Susan to come back for a new dose of poison as soon as she got used to the previous one. She decided that this time she would ask him for painkillers, and if what Berkney said about him was true, then she had a chance. The lady approached the Duke's office, and the young man asked what business the girl was going there for. She said it was nothing important, and if it was busy she could come back later. But the young man admitted that he was sure that Susan could enter the Duke's office, since he had given no special instructions not to let her in. He announced that a lady had arrived, and the Duke asked her to come in at once. A feeling of something ominous enveloped the girl's entire body, and perhaps because there was not a single pleasant memory that would connect her with this place. But when she entered the Duke's office, she was horrified to see the maid Reyna, and her hands were covered in blood. Susan seemed to stop breathing and feeling her whole body when she saw the kindest girl Reyna begging the Duke for mercy. Reyna saw Susan enter the office, and it was obvious that the young maid was incredibly scared. Reyna was the first one to speak to Susan in Ingord, and she was always kind and caring. She became her loyal friend, who helped her adapt to the new environment and not get lost in the chaos of those terrible days. The maid always worked hard to earn a lot of money and help her mother recover from a terrible disease. But now, the good-natured and sweet Reina, with tears in her eyes, stood on her knees in the Duke's office and pronounced the name Susan. The maid asked her friend in a trembling voice to tell her, because she knew everything about her and could help her. She insisted that she was not a spy, but for some reason the gentleman did incredibly terrible things to her. The girl was incredibly frightened, and grabbing the hem of Susan's dress, she insisted that he had clearly mixed something up. She prayed, the Duke thinks. Prince Wilhelm sent her to harm Ingord, and all this time she led a false life and deceived all the people. Reina lay on the floor in tears and asked Susan to prove that this was a complete lie, and they had long since become good friends. After looking around the office, Susan did not see the Duke, but Reina was in a terrible state and covered in blood. At that moment, it seemed to her that the air around her froze, which meant that the Duke was still somewhere nearby. As it turned out, all this time he was just standing and watching attentively, as if waiting for Susan to make a decision. It's like he wanted to know what she would say about this, and he wants her to protect Reina. And is he really ready to listen to the opinion of his faithful dog and really give her the right to vote? But on the other hand, she didn't know that Reina was really innocent. And Susan was terrified and did not understand what decision she should make, because there were two sides to the issue. Licht reported that in words the girl is ready to obey, but as soon as it comes to actions, everything is different. For Licht, it didn't matter. Thoughtfulness is not the main factor in obedience, and that was Licht Ingord, a man who subjugates by will, not by force. When he called her by such a familiar and unfamiliar name at the same time, the lady felt as if she had borne it since birth. The young man said that the world around us is much more complicated than she thinks, and he is trying in every way to fool you. If you don't notice anything beyond your nose, you can become a caged bird, but Susan wasn't smart enough to understand the subtle metaphors. Licht calmly said that there was nothing he could do about it, and that he himself would have to patiently explain everything for the sake of the cute little dog. At that moment, Mr. Keen entered the office and was ready to listen attentively to Licht's orders. He walked up to Susan, next to whom lay a defenseless Reina, still begging for help. Her eyes were full of madness, and she asked the young man to spare her because she had done absolutely nothing. She swore by heaven that she was innocent and asked Susan to help her and avoid a terrible fate. But the lady could only watch submissively as her master treated her cruelly, and at that moment she seemed to stop feeling herself and her body. The Duke smiled and said that now that there were 4 of them again, the scales were balanced again, and wasn't that wonderful? Keen admitted that Susan was very merciful, but she could not avoid the fate of the master's dog. In fact, Susan was already tired of calling him crazy, but his actions proved how cruel and cold-blooded this man was. Reina, having been wounded, still begged the master to spare her and promised to do everything he said, just to stay alive. Licht argued that Reina had so many regrets in her life that she should lift her head and look him in the eye. It was impossible to describe how scared the innocent girl was, but she still looked up and looked at the cruel Duke. He said that he was giving the girl a short reprieve, and now her life or death depended on Susan's decision. And the girl certainly didn't expect that her friend's life would fall on her fragile shoulders so suddenly. Licht gave the lady permission to say whatever she wanted, and to feel free to use any means necessary to convince Susan. The girl again felt this dual feeling, and now she became increasingly afraid of getting involved with the young Duke. The man who had embraced her that day and gently sat her on her horse, and the man who was standing in front of her now seemed like completely different people. On the day the Triviak's mansion burned to the ground, on the day the outbuilding was destroyed, and today, on the day when Reina is suspected of espionage, all these times a completely different person stood before her. Why didn't she realize this before? The Duke was acting like he was out of his mind because of Prince Wilhelm. Susan asked Reina to listen to her carefully, and the terrified girl looked at her with eyes full of hopelessness and despair. She knew that Ingord could not be trusted, never under any circumstances, and that was the only thing she was sure of now. The Duke had spent years gathering around him innocent vassals who could be used, but Reina was dead serious and did not know what kind of relationship Susan had with this man. The lady believed that he was definitely one of those people who indulged his own vanity in every possible way, and that other people were just pawns for him, with the help of which he could undermine the power of the prince. And no one could find a logical explanation for the young master's cruel actions. The Duke has no idea what the girl was whispering now. Otherwise, he would not have left it so easily. Or maybe he actually hears everything well. He just doesn't want to break the rules of his game, and Reina was worried that the Duke would use Susan for his own selfish purposes. This man took the lives of many people, and it was difficult to even call him a man, a merciless killer. He is just a madman, intoxicated by his power. So Reina tearfully begged for help to get Susan out of here, and that's all she really wanted. Susan decided to ask Prince Wilhelm to expel the girl from here, and he will definitely help, because she is infinitely devoted to him. But after these words, Keen threw the girl out the door, and these were the last words she managed to say to her. Susan remained standing in the Duke's office, trying to find the strength to simply take a breath of air. Prince Wilhelm was again involved in many things, and this was not the first time she had heard that name. Hearing this already boring name, she realized something. Contrary to her own will, she had already begun to plunge into this dark pool. Licht admitted that he is a man of his word and always keeps his promises. And he is in no way going to pressure her. She just needs to make the right choice. The lady broke out in a cold sweat when she saw that Duke Licht even smiled sometimes. Usually, the corners of the Duke's lips only lifted when he was mocking or making fun of others. But now he was clearly agitated, even though he pretended not to be. Susan had to collect her thoughts, because the Duke and she had laid all the cards on the table. But for some reason, she could not contain her emotions, and this did not bode well. So the lady said that she did not quite understand what the Duke wanted from her. Susan admitted what right she had to decide in other people's lives, because she was an ordinary servant. But the Duke was interested in her opinion not from the position of a faithful servant, but from a slightly different angle. The girl hid her emotions well, but the Duke assured her that no one could ever deceive his eyes. And looking intently into her face, he declared, he sees that she is shaking like an aspen leaf but does not show it. Then he decided to ask Susan one small question, after which a lot would become clear to him. The lady admitted that anyone in her place would be shaking, and the Duke asked permission to help the lady with something very important. Lack of trust between an owner and his dog is completely unacceptable, and Susan must believe his every word. The lady thought, whatever she said now, the dialogue had already reached a dead end, and if there was any sense in ridiculous excuses. Oddly enough, the girl suddenly developed a headache and her eyes began to see blurrily. She suddenly felt a strong weakness in her body, and at that moment the Licht managed to grab her by the waist so that the girl did not fall to the floor. But she couldn't stay on her feet, and she slowly sank down near the table, asking for forgiveness, because she really tried to believe him. At that moment, the girl completely weakened, and scarlet blood flowed from her mouth like a stream. Licht carefully observed the lady's condition and saw some clear symptoms. He stated that the speed of metastasis was incredible, and it was no wonder that he suddenly lost all human feelings. The lady was bleeding and apologizing to the gentleman, saying that she would definitely feel very ill now. She only wheezed that her body felt like it was being torn apart, and she couldn't stand the hellish pain. The young man asked if the girl wanted to be freed from this pain, and if there was even one person in the world who would refuse such a thing, but Susan wanted to scream, and her words stuck in her throat. The heroine could not utter a word, and her voice seemed to disappear, and her body lost all control. The Duke always did everything his own way, but for some reason now he began to ask strange questions. Not because the pain completely clouds her consciousness, and she is completely unable to understand what thoughts are currently flying through the Duke's head. The young man raised his bloody hand over the girl, but she didn't want to think anything at all, and she had to listen to his voice while he asked her to open her mouth. The poison she drank was made by refining the Duke's blood. So if she drank the unrefined blood, the pain would go away completely. Therefore, he asked the lady to open her mouth, because it would be much more convenient for the required amount of blood to enter her body and provide an anesthetic effect. As Licht had said, the girl did feel better, but she couldn't swallow the amount he was trying to pour in. Licht was indignant. Susan, for no apparent reason, was pretending to be an innocent lamb, although in fact she was a very strong lady. For her, he decided to make one exception and pressed his lips to her mouth until the girl found the strength to reject him. As he pressed his lips to hers, Susan realized that this had happened to her before. Looking at the Duke, she did not understand why his face was so cold and gloomy, but at the same time it seemed as if life was playing in it. Within a few minutes, Susan was able to stand up on her own and felt incredibly good. Licht gave her the vial of blood again and told her that if the girl needed his blood, she could come whenever she wanted. And he warned her not to let her disgust get the better of her and never do it again. It seemed that this was the first time she had seen the Duke so exhausted, because he had always been full of strength and health. Licht confessed that he would spare the maid's life as she wished because he had promised and kept his word. But the young man confessed. The lady clearly understood that in this treacherous world only he was right, and she should only look up to him. This day will not come even in 100 years, and before that, Susan was sure of her thought. She was no longer going to guess what this man was up to, and she had had enough of manipulation and not knowing what was really going on. On the way to her, she came across Keen, who said that apparently the girl was again rushing at full speed to someone for help. It seems the Duke called this young man Kin, but the lady did not understand what he wanted, because before he had not paid any attention to her. But at one point something suddenly changed. The young man confessed that even if he advised the girl something, she would hardly listen to him. He's definitely looking for trouble, so he provokes it at every opportunity. Susan was tired of being bullied by strangers and clearly wasn't in the mood for pointless conversation today. Keen was indignant. Was the lady really ignoring him, and how did she start listening to Birkinen? He followed her and said something, but Susan turned around menacingly and replied that it would be better for Keen to keep quiet, because everything he said was completely meaningless. Keen grinned and said that it was none of his business, but that was not the way to talk to someone who wanted to give good advice. Susan said that if he wanted to talk to someone, why not ask someone else instead of pestering her with indifferent questions? Keen wondered if the lady didn't understand what she was getting into by following her master's orders. Licht asked her to come to him when she could no longer bear it. But does this mean that Birkney does not know what that medicine consists of? He must know, otherwise he would not have warned her. But nothing less than the Duke's blood is the true antidote. Susan felt that she was trapped by evil forces, but now she could do absolutely nothing about it, and all she could do was obey her master. She had no desire to argue with Keen, so she preferred to rest in her room rather than talk empty talk. Keen shouted loudly and called Susan a stupid woman because she knew how His Excellency's poison affected her and still continued to take it. And does she really think that the entire effect of the poison is limited to just ordinary physical pain? Susan did not want to argue with this young man, but just looked in his direction silently. It is completely unclear what he was trying to achieve, or perhaps he simply felt sorry for an ordinary, innocent girl. He stated that the girl was still very young and could not pretend so well, and that Ingord's undiluted poison, when taken in a lethal dose, would destroy all internal organs. And those unfortunate people who take it die a painful death within 24 hours. But what makes the dose less than lethal? The poison will not cause serious harm to the body, but it will cause auditory and visual hallucinations, paralysis, and other symptoms associated with intoxication. And the poison that the lady takes is diluted to an extremely low concentration. But the young man was sure that the lady would soon see that the more her body was poisoned, the more she would want a new dose. In a nutshell, he called her incredibly stupid, who put a leash on her own neck and there would be no turning back. Perhaps the girl is now easily tolerating the intoxication, but this poison is more addictive than others, and it is like a drug. And does Susan really want to become Ingord's dog, who can't stay sane without his help? Susan replied that the young man should not exaggerate, since the Duke had only helped her twice, and in response to this, Keen only grinned. Nowhere else in the world would you see a situation like this, and the young man was sure that the lady already had one foot in the grave. In fact, Susan didn't know where to look for the truth. But what she did was her choice alone. He asked the girl not to look at her with such a piercing gaze, because it even sent a chill down his spine, but no matter what, they had to face any difficulties head-on. They went down the stairs, and the young man confessed that the lady could not thank him, because a kinder man than he was in everything, and Ingord could not be found. He wished her a happy stay, but the girl clearly felt that something was wrong here. Keen didn't seem to notice, but there was a clear contradiction in his words. Susan was drinking undiluted poison, and what he called poison was the Duke's blood, and he simply couldn't know what symptoms it was causing. Or it turns out that Susan is somehow special and her body quickly got used to the poison, so she didn't even notice. It seemed he wanted to say that she would really stay here forever if she followed the master's orders, and she will spend the rest of her days in Ingord, serving the cruel Duke Licht. The next morning was a normal one for Susan, and she was busy cleaning one of the rooms in the estate. Raina was recently removed from her post, and there will be a lot of talk about it now. Susan felt that this would be so, and the Duke indeed kept his word. Thanks to this whole situation, the girl understood something about Licht. He doesn't lie and doesn't make up things that don't exist, but at the same time, he still remains a cruel manipulator. Whether intentionally or not, he always gives out information in bits and pieces, narrowing the lady's view. Susan could not calmly tell him that she was hurt or sad, because her position and his were not equal. She had been patient for a long time, but now it was her turn to say everything she thought about the situation that had happened. One day, Licht asked the girl to remember his main words, and at that moment she was very attentive to his every word. You need to hit the most vital point, which is on the neck, so that the enemy has no chance to survive. The lady secretly took the dagger with her, and it was good that she was barefoot, so at least she would not make a single sound. She held the sharp knife behind her back and tried not to wind herself up any further and breathe deeply. And as soon as she entered the master's bedroom with a knife in her hands, she heard his quiet voice that Susan definitely needed to learn to walk more quietly. And did she really think that just by taking off her shoes, she had already solved the most important problem? Now she stood in the dead of night in his bedroom, with a knife behind her back, and the venerable gentleman sat in front of her on the sofa. He said it was important to be able to leave no traces, but one must not forget about other important details. Susan wasn't at all surprised. It wasn't as if she hadn't foreseen this outcome, but it seemed that Berkney hadn't managed to teach her everything. Her heart was no longer pounding like it was about to jump out of her chest. Her hands were no longer shaking, and it seemed like she had finally managed to get control of herself. Licht admitted that he is always on guard, and even in the deepest night he will not sleep, expecting a threat from someone. They stood opposite each other in his room, and the girl held in her hands a long dagger, with which she had recently been going to finish off the cruel Duke. With one movement of his hand, he snatched the dagger from the girl, and further events could have unfolded in any way. The lady screamed for the Duke to answer what exactly he wanted from her, because he could have simply killed her when he killed all the maids. And does he really think it's fun to use her for his own amusement, and is it really possible to play cruelly with people like that? He grabbed her hand, which held the dagger, and said, "Is everything that is happening really so incredibly funny?" And if she asks him, and she is truly interested, then he is ready to answer that such entertainment does not bring him joy. After all, a creature like her doesn't particularly interest him, and he doesn't see any benefit in it. And at that moment, Licht asked an unusual question. Was the girl really the same demoness who had dragged him into sheer hell? Susan didn't understand why the Duke called her a demoness, because she was just an ordinary servant. The lady threw the blade on the floor, and the young man continued to stand humbly nearby, probably preparing to tell an interesting story. He said that if she wanted to leave, he would definitely help her with this. And Susan only needed to cut off both of her legs, and then he would allow her to crawl away from here. He gave the girl a sword with a gilded hilt so that she could make her own decision whether to stay with him or choose freedom. Susan was surprised at what a noble and wonderful chance the Duke had given her, but it was truly madness. All you need to do is get rid of some useless legs, and then you can get away from this insidious madman and never meet him again in your life. She held a sharp sword in her hands and looked at her feet, and all this seemed to her like an incredibly terrible dream. Weak-minded people usually don't even have the right to meet their end, but the young man wondered how many more times the lady would try. His Excellency Duke Licht Ingord is all cold mockery and a mad grin, as if there was absolutely nothing human about him. But for some reason now he was incredibly angry, and this was the first sincere emotion he showed. Susan couldn't understand him at all, but suddenly in the future she would lose this opportunity and would remain with the villain forever. He asked the lady if she thought she could get back if she had died a miserable death on the way, and as he understood, she had already thought about it, and that was why she still couldn't decide. Licht stated that the lady was not sure that she would return back to her supposedly safe world, which also had nothing good in it. She stood next to the young man and did not understand who he really was and how he understood all this, as if the person standing in front of her was not a living person at all. Susan didn't realize that she had revealed her fears, but for some reason, Licht Ingord guessed them right now. The Duke admitted that he had wanted to ask Susan so many things if he tried to count how long he had kept everything to himself. It had been at least half a month. And does the girl really think that their meeting was just an unfortunate, ordinary coincidence? And had she never wondered who she was, and at that moment the lady remembered the Duke's words that it was she who had dragged him into this living hell? She assumed that Licht Ingord had known her for a long time, and pushing the guy aside, she screamed, did he really know who she was? The young man smiled and replied that he had known Susan for an incredibly long time, very well, and even better than himself. If you think about it, this fact was obvious from the very beginning, and indeed, she was not the mistress of this mortal body all the time. There was that story about Agrian and Licht, and very few people knew that story. Agrian was a character from the Duke's mysterious past, and the entire future fate of the novel, The Sun Flowing into the River, depends on her. And how stupid Susan turned out to be, because she could not even for a moment think that he, like her, was completely out of this world. And the next second, the young man offered the girl to make a deal. He admitted that she had risked her life to come, and he could not ignore it. So he suggested that they rely on each other not in words, but in deeds. Licht confidently offered to make a bet on whether he could or could not tame her, and if he won, he would definitely tell the girl the whole truth. Now her body, which is as if alive, is poisoned by his blood, and he can heal her and then never come near her again. Susan thought his words were complete nonsense and screamed that she would never believe his beautiful speeches again, because if she lost, he would only mock her even more. Licht said the lady was wrong, and even if he wins, he is ready to give her whatever she wants. Even if she asks for the entire empire, it will belong to her. But in return, she will have to never take Wilhelm's side, and this is his only condition. But for Susan, it was some kind of strange bet, because he hated Wilhelm so much, and it was too much, and she did not understand what benefit Licht had. But she would find out only when she agreed. Licht extended his hand to the girl as a sign of making a bet, but the lady understood that this was too strange, and it was hard to believe that it was the Duke who could offer such a thing. He assured that all that was required of the girl was to follow him everywhere and anywhere, not allowing the thought that it could be any other way, and so on until the very end of the bet. These were quite reasonable and advantageous conditions, and is it even possible to lose such a bet? The outcome of this conversation will decide the future fate. Some time will pass, and in any case, the girl will ultimately get everything she wants. But there was no guarantee that she would return to her world if she died in this one, and what she needed now was a very definite way to escape from here, not a vague one. Susan would probably have to succumb to Licht's sweet speeches once again, and she gave him her hand in agreement without hesitation. They shook hands to conclude their argument, each of them walking a fine line between trust and truth. But Susan couldn't understand one thing why the Duke made this deal with her. The young man had no good reason for this, and he also could not give a more specific answer to the girl's question. He thoughtfully turned his eyes to the side and said in a quiet voice that he simply had different thoughts on the matter, and in fact, he had been yearning for her for a very long time. The next morning, the maid asked Susan with a happy smile if she had heard the latest news. She asked Mary not to rush headlong, but she wanted to tell the maid something very important. The other day, a gathering of aristocrats took place in the mansion, and surely everyone remembers that young and handsome Viscount Mr. Semble. This young man even behaved very politely with the maids, and you don't see that often, so I was pleasantly surprised even by the alliance. The lady said with a joyful voice that the young man had a certain message for the girl. Madame Colento thought about it for a long time and told His Excellency about it, so the young Duke was already aware of it. And judging by her words, this is not the first time this has happened without a doubt. Licht burned him right through with a contemptuous look when he met the Viscount. The address on the envelope was addressed to dear Miss Susan, and he meant her. It had only been a few weeks since Mary had replaced Reina, but she had already become so close to Madame Colento. Susan should have praised the maid for getting used to it so quickly. But now the girl thought for a long time before saying anything. Rumor has it that he also asked the servants for Susan's name, asking them the name of a certain charming maid. And that's not all. He even wrote a long poem in her honor, in which he praised the mesmerizing green of her eyes, which contrasted so charmingly with the shadows under her eyelashes. But the lady knew that there was no question of any shadows. It was just that her skin had changed color a little from constant lack of sleep. Unfortunately, she could no longer boast about sleeping well, so she decided to say nothing about the gossip because the maids were nice girls after all. In a way, he was right, and she too sometimes found herself unable to take her eyes off Susan's, as if her body was frozen and her depth was drawing her in. The maids were discussing how, when Susan first arrived here, her eyes were not at all like they are now, but lately they look lifeless. And it is quite possible that the lady is tormented by nightmares, so one of the maids asked her to take the medicine she gave her and not to skip meals. Otherwise, she will have no energy left. Thanks to the genuine care, Susan felt as if she could breathe much easier in this terrible dream. That same day, Berkney called Susan to go with him, and the lady asked, since their practice had long since come to an end. But on this day, His Excellency called the girl for another matter. Licht had asked her to come into his office about 3 or 4 times in the last month. He demanded a report on his physical condition after adaptation to the poison, on his daily routine, on his relationships with other roomers, in general, on everything in the world down to the smallest detail. Susan felt like he was trying to control her entire life, which, thanks to her stories, was in the palm of his hand. Birkin reported that it seemed that the lady had behaved a little rudely towards Keene, and asked her to improve relations with him, since she herself should understand that it would be better this way. Susan replied rudely, they would not get along until this scoundrel became more human, and it seemed neither of them was going to give in to the other. They stopped outside the young gentleman's office, and the venerable youth announced that the lady could enter without knocking. For some time now, Bernke has been insisting that she and Licht conduct a dialogue in private, a prospect that used to terrify her beyond belief, but now she just felt a little uneasy, as if there was an untamed beast sitting under her nose. Susan entered the office cautiously, knowing he couldn't be in his place again, but she saw the gentleman lying on the bed. It was the first time she had seen Licht sleeping right in his office, and she whispered the gentleman's name. Susan looked closely at his features, and at that moment Licht looked so harmless and innocent. And the whole world seemed to no longer matter, and perhaps for the girl it was an awkward feeling. The girl whispered his name, and after a few seconds the young man slowly opened his eyes, the color of the sky before an upcoming storm or hurricane. She stood silently next to the Duke and waited for him to wake up and tell her why he had called her. Opening his eyes, he whispered to her never to call him that again unless she wanted to provoke him. The Duke had just said provoke, and Susan did not understand what the young master meant by that phrase. The Duke raised himself and snapped his fingers, as if hinting that with one movement the maid should come closer to him. He called her over as if she were his little dog, and Susan came closer to the young master. In the young gentleman's hand was a white envelope with a red seal, and he announced that the gala banquet was to take place in 3 days. Once they leave town, Susan must become Beatrice Kale, a completely new person. At this banquet, the girl will have to pretend to be a lady of noble blood, which she has never been before. For several days now, they had been preparing her for this role, but during this time, they had not yet managed to touch on the rules of conduct at banquets. Beatrice was historically the 22nd queen of the Kingdom of Kale on the southern continent, a rather short-sighted 19-year-old girl. When her mother was overthrown, Beatrice was removed from the fight for the throne. It was a completely unreal person, but she had gone missing last year, and it was a pretty detailed biography for a non-existent person. The Kingdom of Kale has little involvement in the affairs of the empire, and the women of the ruling family usually wear veils to hide their faces, so the problem may lie in one thing. Prince Wilhelm, who had officially announced his intention not to attend the banquet, suddenly changed his mind, which will make it more difficult to take all the variables into account. And it turns out that the Principal Wilhelm himself will be present at the banquet, or he will change his mind and everything will work out. It must not be forgotten that Licht Ingord becomes more cruel when it comes to Prince Wilhelm. Susan was to keep her distance from the prince when he was not around, but if she needed to, could she splash guilt in His Highness's face and remain unpunished? But the young man said that she could do whatever her heart desired, as long as it did not contradict his request. The way Licht talks about Wilhelm makes you wonder how dangerous he really is. However, in the novel The Sun Spreading in the River, Prince Wilhelm does not seem so dangerous, despite all of Licht's warnings. But when it comes down to it, the real villain of this story is sitting right in front of Susan. They were supposed to leave town tomorrow, but Susan lay in her bed, unable to sleep because of obsessive thoughts. Did Reyna manage to reach Prince Wilhelm safely, or was she cruelly dealt with along the way? But if she did get there, did she tell Wilhelm about her friend's sad situation? And whatever the case, tomorrow she would finally leave Ingord for the first time in several months. If only Count Triviash were alive, he would take the girl back to his mansion. Or Prince Wilhelm, standing at his friend's side, came to her to save her as Reyna promised. But now Susan lay in bed at the Ingord estate and was sure that all this was simply impossible. After all, she understood perfectly well that in this way she would never be able to hide from the cruel Licht. The next morning the Duke was already prepared for departure and was waiting for the lady in the courtyard of the estate. Susan assumed that the Duke must have been waiting for her for a long time, but suddenly he heard the lady's thin voice apologizing because she had been looking at the beautiful flowers for a while. He saw before him a girl with long golden hair, luxuriously dressed and smiling happily, and it was that same fake heroine, Beatrice. In this image of a beautiful aristocrat, she incredibly wanted to fall through the ground, but everything would be fine. But she has to play the Duke's beloved. She is not a real queen. And is there really a need to pretend now that they are close? Susan was doing a great job of playing the role of a joyful and happy aristocrat who announced that today was such a beautiful sunny day, and they had a long journey ahead of them. She couldn't imagine a better role than that of the loving other half of a cruel duke, and Susan's luck seemed to know no bounds. Licht, on the contrary, does not seem to be at all against her role, and unlike his servants, who seemed puzzled by the sudden appearance of the Duke's beloved. The lady whispered to the young gentleman whether he liked her image, because Susan really looked like a rich and noble aristocrat living in joy and luxury. Beatrice admitted that she was trying very hard to fulfill her role, and at that moment Licht unexpectedly took her hand and kissed her forehead with all sensuality right in front of all the courtiers. Playing the aristocrat Beatrice was not easy for young Susan because she was all on edge and her body was more tense and constrained than ever. The young man suggested that they go in separate carriages, but the lady in a thin voice was indignant that the young man refused to go with her, and that they would under no circumstances go separately. The young man confessed that he was very afraid that the girl might lose her head because of her passion for him, because her feelings would become stronger every day. Susan looked at the young gentleman with excitement, as if this time his words rang true, sending goosebumps through her body. Licht was definitely crazy, but he clearly couldn't say such words seriously, although given Licht's inexplicable obsession and his nature, anything is possible. The lady smiled and stated that Licht was incredibly romantic and he should immediately climb into the carriage and ride together to the festive event. She gave him her hand and asked him to hurry, confessing at the top of her voice that she wanted to tell so much to the young gentleman, whom she had not seen for a long time. At last they found themselves together in the same carriage, sitting opposite each other, looking at the luxurious outfits. Susan asked the gentleman for permission to get some sleep on the road, and if there was anything she should know, but Licht asked not to call himself that until they were completely out of character, as habit was second nature. Everything happened very strangely. From the day when she, as if mad, made her way into his room to kill, he began to behave inhumanely towards the girl noticeably less often, and from then on he no longer forced her to do anything. And nevertheless, the feeling between them never disappeared. The young gentleman arrived with Beatrice at the palace where the event was to take place, and she asked to go out first while the young man took care of the luggage. The banquet was held in honor of the birthday of Marquis Kreutz, who by chance found himself in the city immediately after Ariel Kreutz was rescued from Ingord's burning outbuilding. It was an incredibly strange culture when, frankly speaking, the main enemies were invited to a banquet, and instead of refusing, they accepted the invitation. The lady wondered if she and the young man would be staying in different rooms, but perhaps they should not be separated, otherwise how would they be able to look after each other? Unfortunately, the queen's honor must be protected from dirty rumors, but the lady assured him that there was no honor to speak of, since rumors did not bother her at all, and she loved her young master so much. Licht smiled and said what a truly touching confession it was, and Beatrice had really played her part wonderfully. She exceeded even all her expectations, but noticed how the maids looked at them with a suspicious look, wishing the couple who entered the room good night. The hotel's staff simply never ended, and even here in the borderland, Duke Licht maintains his reputation. Keen should be in the room opposite. If something happens, he can be safely called. But Beatrice asked the young man not to be stupid and not to think that everything can be resolved by itself. Beatrice wondered what was going on with the young master's security, since none of the guards were around. But the young man insisted that no one in their right mind would dare to break into his room, and he was completely sure of it. This is the real Licht, and it is he who holds the girl on a leash. And the lady suggested that they look around a little together, but the young man said that he had important business. He had already planned a meeting in advance. He asked Beatrice to forgive him for the fact that today they would not be able to walk around the city at night, and it seemed that she understood that it was not by chance that he said these words so clearly and loudly. The lady smiled and said that in fact she herself wanted to go to bed early, and therefore was not at all upset, and the young man should not be upset either. They laughed and had fun, pretending to be a couple in love, and Beatrice said loudly that no matter how much she wanted to spend time with her lover, she could always wait. And finally, the young man said a few more words to the girl so that she would try to get out of her golden cage, because she would definitely succeed if she was so sure that she would become freer. They stood in the corridor for a while so that as many people as possible could see their couple, and the lady spoke loudly about how she could leave her beloved and only Licht. The Duke wished the girl good night away from her, and his gaze pierced the girl to the very heart. But at the same time, it was warm and caring. She walked into the guest room and closed the door behind her, finally being alone with herself for a long time, without servants and courtiers, and in a completely different place. Maybe not entirely sincerely, but he seemed to be pushing the girl towards the idea of escaping, and perhaps because Licht Ingord simply longed to hunt someone. Once in the luxurious room, the lady decided that it was time for her to relax a little, but she was not sure that she would have a chance to rest properly again soon, so now she needed to take advantage of any chance. There was a huge library in the room, and taking off her outerwear, the girl went to the bookshelves and took one of the books that she had not seen for a long time. The lady was incredibly happy to stay in a new place, so she took a bunch of books and simply laid them out on the bed and collapsed next to it from fatigue. She felt as if she was dreaming, but every second she seemed to be waiting for Licht to come to her, although this definitely could not happen. He made it clear that he had an important meeting, but for some reason she still counted on him to come to her before bed. She waited for him, just like a dog faithfully waits for its owner. The girl didn't notice how she fell asleep on the bed, but suddenly woke up from the feeling of cold metal on her face, and it was already deep night outside the window. Indeed, a man in a mask leaned over her and asked the lady not to open her mouth under any circumstances, because if she tried to shout anything, he would cause her such unimaginable torment that she had never even dreamed of. Susan's life was now in danger, but she was not afraid at all because nothing could compare to Licht, and her face was hidden by a thick veil, and there was no man in the world who would not lose his vigilance next to a defenseless woman, and all that was left was to guess the right moment. The robber said that he would ask the girl questions. She was obliged to answer them by shaking her head, and warned that it would be better for Beatrice to tell only the truth. He asked if the Duke was really threatening her life, but instead of answering, the lady remained adamantly silent and looked at the robber. He had no idea what she had to do to save her life, and at that moment the girl was about to pull out a sharp blade from under her veil. Her body had completely absorbed Ingord's poison, and perhaps her tears were also poisonous, and this young man was clearly making a mistake now. But suddenly a voice was heard nearby, asking the man to lower his weapon. A fair-haired young man with red eyes stood near the window and carefully watched what was happening. He apologized for his rudeness and said he had no intention of harming the queen, and in the face of the young, polite man, she clearly recognized Prince William, who was now standing right in front of her. The main character of the novel The Sun Spreading in the River, and by his own testimony, the Prince of the Greenfirk Empire. This young man was the only hope of the vast, decaying Greenfirk Empire. And if Licht can be considered a lone predator, then Wilhelm was the alpha of the pack, followed by the entire high society. Prince William ordered the robber to lower his weapon, and Susan was simply speechless at what was happening. She tried to find out why Prince Wilhelm was doing this, but the young man asked her not to interfere anymore because he had already done an excellent job. He stated that he did not know how much Queen Beatrice knew about the situation in the empire, but asked that his name not be mentioned as much as possible, so as not to put himself in danger. He clearly stated that he came here specifically to save the girl, because the most terrible rumors had reached him. He admitted that he had been following the family for a long time. He knew everything about the Duke, his place of birth, his views on things, his personal affairs, and he also knew very well about his close associates. The lady screamed. The political intrigues of the Greenfirk Empire did not concern her in any way, and she took no part in it. But the young man claimed that as long as she was near the Duke, they had a direct relationship with her, especially considering the fact that she had unexpectedly appeared out of nowhere. Susan asked if William had decided to approach her only because she was the Duke's mistress. He considered the word too vulgar for the Queen, but the lady did not understand what caused the young man to suddenly burst into her bedroom at such a late hour with the robber. Wilhelm openly stated that Duke Licht was his worst enemy, and that this alone was the reason for everything that had happened. Therefore, the young man needs the help of the Duke's mistress, but Beatrice wondered why she should trust a stranger. Wilhelm had already rescued several of the Duke's vassals, whom he had been holding, and they were now living free under his safe protection. But in the girl's situation, that was the least he could promise, for she would never again face Licht's cruel treatment. The lady assured him that if she agreed to help him, she would inevitably run into the Duke, but the young man insisted that this would never happen, and if Queen Beatrice agreed to help, he promised to give her protection and complete safety. He intended to take the girl with him immediately after tomorrow's ball, so that she would be safe and out of the Duke's reach, and politely extended his hand to Susan. Here again, something was wrong, because in the original novel, Wilhelm was not so active in trying to keep Licht in check, and it would be many more years before the first blood was spilled on the soil of the Empire. But it was completely unclear whether other time travelers who were also connected to their rulers were involved in this. Wilhelm argued that the lady was not obliged to give an immediate answer, because he understood that she needed to weigh and think everything over carefully. So the young man smiled and said that he would definitely look forward to meeting Queen Beatrice at tomorrow's banquet, and that she should already have thought of something by then. The lady asked the young man to stop, but the next second he simply jumped down from the balcony, not giving her a chance to answer. Prince Wilhelm disappeared as suddenly as he had appeared, and his partner was still standing in the bedroom as the false Queen Beatrice. The bedroom door opened and young Mr. Keen appeared, grinning at the whole thing. He realized that Prince Wilhelm's lackeys were already there, and Keen had arrived just in time to personally verify that Prince Wilhelm was already here. His expression was exactly the same as the day the Triviox house burned to the ground in that terrible tragedy. Could he have known that Wilhelm's man would show up in Susan's room in advance? Or would he suddenly also realize that they had just tried to persuade her to the other side? The Duke could not be expected to suspect anything, so Susan grabbed a sharp blade and tried to attack the bandit standing nearby. As soon as the girl took out the sharp blade, Kin ran to her aid, and the robber realized that the lady was pretending that someone was really trying to kill her. Keen took out his weapon in cold blood, and his gaze showed only fury and uncontrollable anger. Before Susan could even blink, the lady immediately plunged a sharp blade into the robber's chest, and streams of blood covered the bed and the snow-white walls. But the lady didn't even realize that she was the first to plunge the sharp blade into the robber's body, because she needed to make it look like she had just been attacked. The maid looked in horror at the lifeless body of the robber, and only now realized that with her own hands she had thrust a knife straight into his heart, like a blow. She sat down on the bed in horror, realizing that she had just wounded a person for the first time in her life. But this was exactly what Berkney had taught her, to hit the most vital point. Her hands were shaking incredibly hard, but she could still feel his heartbeat on her fingertips. Keen admired the girl's courage. It was quite brave for someone who had never hurt anyone before, and he was happy to praise Susan. As it turned out, Keen heard a noise in His Excellency's chambers, and the first thing he did was rush to check Queen Beatrice's bedroom. She still didn't understand why he went to her first, but Keen called the girl only extremely slow-witted, saying that he didn't have to grovel before her every time and explain his actions. And no one is so foolish as to directly attack Mr. Ingord, so the only one who can receive uninvited guests is Queen Beatrice. Now everything became clearer to the girl, and indeed it was unlikely that anyone would dare to enter the Duke's chambers. It turned out that Keene had long seen through their plans, and Queen Beatrice was just bait for Prince William, who was definitely planning to visit her that night. She never thought she would ever say this, but she was really glad that Berg didn't teach her how to properly handle a bladed weapon, but she never imagined that she would ever use her knowledge in such a way. Keene wrapped the girl in a sheet and, taking her hand, led her to an unknown place, and she only had to obey him. She didn't understand where he was leading her, but she didn't decide anything in this situation, and only followed the orders of the master and his assistants. He took her to his room and covered her with a sheet, saying that Queen Beatrice could be attacked again at any moment, and now she needed special security. He covered her with blankets and pillows and declared that he would now personally guard her, and that she would have to shut her mouth and go to sleep immediately to rest before the event tomorrow. The lady wondered if she would have to sleep right in the same room with him, but Kim was sure that nothing should bother her except her saved life. Since she has an important mission tomorrow, she must not lose face at the banquet, because she simply did not get enough sleep and trembled with fear all night, afraid that someone might attack her again. The lady claimed that it was easy for Keene to say this wasn't the first time in his life that he had stabbed another person, and the lady was shocked by what she had just done with her own hands. It seemed that Keene's patience had finally come to an end, and wrapping the girl in a blanket, he pushed her onto the comfortable bed. He stated that there was nothing so terrible about it, that it was worth worrying and being afraid of, and now the lady just needed to try to sleep and gather strength for tomorrow's event. Even then, in front of the burning Triviak mansion, Keene noticed that this lady was unusually balanced, unlike her crying and constantly screaming friends. He also noted that when a girl is scared, her lips begin to tremble, but this only lasts for a few moments, which distinguishes her from other ladies. He asked what human death was, but for the lady there seemed to be only two kinds, advantageous and disadvantageous, and she was much more terrible than Mr. Birkney himself. But the girl couldn't be blamed for that. Anyone would become like that if pushed to the edge of a cliff, but Keene was sure that she hadn't been much different from the rest of them from the start. And His Excellency only allowed the lady to awaken her true instincts, which sat somewhere deep inside. Soyuzen screamed at the young man to shut up immediately, because he knew absolutely nothing about her, and he was a complete fool who wasn't even on friendly terms with the basic logic of things. And only thanks to His Excellency, this supposedly defenseless girl became a real beast, ready to bite out anyone's throat at any moment. Susan looked at Keene with a cruel look, stating that she was indeed becoming a beast, so the boy should back off immediately. The lady also sternly stated that if Keene did not want her to rip out his tongue by the roots, he should immediately bite it and close his mouth. Keene didn't answer, and the girl was left standing all alone, finally feeling an inner core in the face of evil. He didn't say a word to me, despite the fact that she openly threatened him, but in fact she found out about it only recently. She and Birkney are the only ones in all of Ingord who were poisoned by the Duke's poison. Although Kin hinted to her that she would always remain in Ingord, since he obviously knew about the existence of the poison, he himself does not have resistance to toxins. Maybe she should put some of her blood in his food and that would shut him up, since he claims she's not much different from the people of Ingord. It wasn't even funny at all. Susan wasn't even a character in this novel to begin with, and until she got into this world, she was real. But after that, her life changed dramatically, and her personality slowly began to disappear under the influence of the cruel Duke, who was going to make her his unpretentious dog. As soon as the lady thought about this, she clearly realized that she had absolutely no memory of who she was before she got into the novel, and who she really was. But it wasn't that important now, and Susan decided to think about it later, once all the serious events had settled down a little. Now she was very, very simply tired. Today had been an incredibly long day, and the lady just wanted to sleep peacefully in bed in complete safety. But for some reason the room was incredibly quiet, and the girl's heart was pounding wildly from this silence. Licht had no way of knowing that the principal of Wilhelm himself had come to her, that is, to Beatrice, that night. But she was worried about why he didn't want to talk to her then. Was it because he wanted to deal with Prince Wilhelm's other minions first? Or was it because he simply had nothing to discuss with her, since she was just a dog in his eyes? She remembered the words of the young master. Even if he won, he was ready to give the girl everything she wanted, even if she asked for the entire empire, and it would belong to her. But the only condition was that she should not in any way take Wilhelm's side, and there could be no talk of that. He was so insistent that she not choose Wilhelm, and he must be busy torturing the would-be murderers involved. The girl was tormented by obsessive thoughts, but she understood that she just needed to rest and not think about anything else, because tomorrow was another difficult day, full of uncertainty and danger. Finally, the next morning arrived, and a maid arrived in Queen Beatrice's bedroom, wishing her mistress a good morning. It was now exactly 6 hours and 17 minutes, but Beatrice insisted that the girl was not usually expected to arrive to events on time, and that was why she was deliberately delayed. Comfortably settled on the sofa in their festive attire, the lady was informed that Duke Licht was waiting for her in the main hall. Surprisingly, Beatrice really had fun playing the role of an aristocrat, so she confessed that there was nothing more joyful than waiting for a loved one, and asked the maid not to rush her, because she would definitely come out soon. Beatrice took advantage of the chance, because when else would she have such an opportunity to make Licht wait for her, so she needed to enjoy the role of his beloved queen to her heart's content. 30 minutes later, Beatrice slowly descended into the main hall, but she found it completely inconvenient to move because of her long veil, so one of the palace servants led her by the arm. He said that His Excellency was waiting for the girl at the bottom of the stairs, and they were to meet soon. Susan enjoyed being in the role of an aristocrat who could do anything, and here she had a lot to do as the dim-witted Beatrice. She screamed Licht's name as loudly as she could, and then decided to run up and lean on his chest like the most loving lady. The Duke moved confidently and gracefully around the room, radiating aristocracy and confidence, and his every movement was reminiscent of the impeccable taste and grandeur that had been associated with his family for centuries. Susan noticed the elegant appearance of the young man and felt that all eyes in the room were focused only on him. Coming closer to him, she would never have thought that the man with such a beautiful expression on his face only wanted to stick a knife into the chest of his worst enemy, Wilhelm. He admitted that Beatrice looked very charming, and frankly speaking, the girl wanted to say the same thing to him. She laughed happily and asked if the young gentleman was angry with her for being late, since she simply wanted to look perfect that day and carefully selected her jewelry. The young man was completely exhausted, but the appearance of the young queen was worth it, and he could wait for her for an eternity. The lady made Licht freeze in sweet languor with her mere presence, but she already knew it, because she liked to torment him, and she was a truly insidious woman. This time, his words really did sound quite sincere, and for a moment Beatrice felt as if Licht was a completely normal person. She asked if not everyone wants to see various confirmations of their chosen one's love and know how serious he is, know how dear his chosen one is to him. People love it when everyone shows them love, and that's exactly what happened. A snow-white smile lit up Beatrice's face, and she felt everything blossoming inside her, because she understood that she was loved by this man, and they both loved each other, despite the false game. Her words must have sounded very plausible, and no wonder, because she knew what love was, even though she had never experienced it in anyone else. She noticed that there were a huge number of people in the hall, and what if the love was not mutual? It was incredibly interesting to look at the society of aristocrats, their false smiles, feelings, and relationships. Licht wondered if the lady was one of those who got tired of one-sided love and gave up, or if the opposite had happened in her life. The heroine laughed, and it wasn't mutual love because she had never thought about it before, but she also knew that she would never succeed if she had real feelings for a person. She loudly declared that she had Licht, her boundless love, and the young man considered this to be the most exemplary answer. Sometimes the union felt freer in this image, as if she could speak without thinking and admit to things that she did not really feel. The lady asked if there was someone else in his heart and there was no chance that she would become his. Would he give up in that case, as most young people do? Licht really thought about what to answer to this question and admitted that he would still try to do everything possible, if only the lady of his heart would express her sincere love to him. The queen even thought she heard sadness in his quiet voice, but at that moment he found her, leaned towards her, and said in a quiet voice that in any case he would tame the disobedient lady in every possible way. And whoever this rebellious one is, sooner or later she will get tired of such persistence, and will still give in and give him her heart. For her, it would all end in a real hell on earth, and Susan understood this perfectly well. Servants in elegant liveries stood near luxurious carriages, waiting for their masters at the majestic palace. Each carriage, painted in rich colors and decorated with gold details, sparkled in the light of the evening sun, reflecting an atmosphere of aristocratic splendor. The butler promised to take the noble guests directly to the Kreutz mansion, and as soon as the lady got into the carriage with the Duke, the oppressive silence fell again. She wondered what would happen if she asked that the prince and Wilhelm had come to see her yesterday, or if he had been waiting specifically for her to talk to him about it, since there would be no better moment for such a conversation. After some time they arrived, and while the lady was thinking, she did not have time to tell him anything at all, but she believed that she would definitely cope with everything herself. Holding his hand submissively, she wondered whether she should be wary of anyone else besides Prince William. Licht said that we should be careful with his close associates, and in any case, they will be far away from here tomorrow, so there is no need to worry so much. The young man asked the girl to be careful and not to be afraid of anyone, and this would be enough for their mission to be successful. All the aristocrats will know that Queen Beatrice has arrived with Duke Licht, and that they are a true couple, and that nothing can destroy their strong love. Susan is about to find herself in a world that is alien to her, which she could previously only discuss with other maids while sitting in the kitchen and drinking tea. It would be her first time attending a banquet where there were only aristocrats, the smells of expensive perfumes and cosmetics, and her head was already starting to spin. Licht leaned over and confidently asked the girl not to forget that she was a real queen, and not just some pretend servant. She also plays the role of a girl who is head over heels in love with him, and she should also remember this. As the queen and the duke entered the banquet hall, the light from the lamps gently illuminated their faces, giving the moment an almost magical glow. Even from afar, she could hear the whispers of the crowd, and all 5 of her senses were heightened after she had become accustomed to Ingord's poison. Some argued that they would not last a month at most. Some discussed how the Duke had attracted the attention of a foreigner, and some were sure that since she was a woman of the ruling family, by tradition she was supposed to wear a veil. And all these people were like my sinister snakes, who were not shy about discussing the new person who had entered aristocratic society. For them, she was like a mysterious animal in a cage, from which they wanted to remove the veil in order to take a closer look. And each of the ladies wanted to look into the face of the one who accompanies Duke Licht at such a solemn hour. Judging only by the stories of Prince Wilhelm, everyone thought that Licht was a ruthless demon. But this is a very hidden side of his personality that is not so easy to discover without becoming his future enemy. He is now undoubtedly the most talked about man in the Empire, in the eyes of those who came to this. But they cannot even imagine that a man like him could somehow be at odds with Prince Wilhelm. And no one, looking at his slight smile, would think that a cruel murderer stands before them. The aristocracy of all of Greenfirk must have had their ideas about the Duke turned upside down. Suddenly, a young man in a purple suit approached him and asked if the legend would mind exchanging greetings with him. The Duke respectfully stated that he had no objection, while the young man asked His Excellency's close friend if she would like to introduce herself. Susan introduced herself in a gentle voice as Beatrice, and immediately warned that she was not just another boring queen, and the young man noted that the lady spoke the imperial language with amazing fluency. The lady laughed, saying, "Didn't every queen get a basic education?" and seemed to remember why his name seemed so familiar. It was the same guy who wrote the message, and the lady who approached him was surprised at how amazingly beautiful Beatrice was, up close. It was common courtesy, but it was better for no one to know that the face of a pale servant was hidden under the veil. All she had to do was stand there and smile like a cute doll, and Susan had no idea that it would be so incredibly boring. At that moment, an unfamiliar gentleman approached Licht, and the queen had to move away from him for a while. He leaned towards his beloved and declared that if something suddenly happened, she should definitely call him, and he would rush there that very second. The music playing in the background created a festive atmosphere, and soon the invited ladies and gentlemen, delighted by the majestic couple, began to gather around. As soon as Licht left, all the attention of the aristocracy turned to Queen Beatrice, and all the ladies cast slippery glances, as if by accident. Licht seemed to have mentioned that he didn't care what she did before they left, and it seemed like one of the girls was already interested in asking Queen Beatrice something. The lady asked who the girl in the red dress was, because she had attracted her attention from afar. She was definitely different from the other women here, but she didn't look like a foreigner, and as expected, wary glances were immediately directed at her. Beatrice was embarrassed to approach her herself, as she did not want to say anything unnecessary, and it was necessary to lull the vigilance of the aristocrats with a small lie. Susan stated that this lady looked like the woman her father loved. She also always wore chic, plain dresses, and kept a little distance from others. The girl did not want to seem like a gossip who knew nothing, and the aristocrats themselves told her that this was the same Countess Jasmine. She was the prince's mistress, but her origins were not the most noble. Everyone was talking about this lady, and they say that she lies in bed for days on end, does not leave her room, and does not know how to behave at banquets at all. She is indecently annoying with her laughter and opens her mouth so wide that all the contents are visible. Princess Beatrice slowly approached the lady in the red dress, because she really interested her. Aristocratic women say all these terrible things, and yet they really think that they will not lose respect in the eyes of others. And for aristocratic society, these were common things. As far as Beatrice remembered, Countess Jasmine had never carried the emperor's child. But the father may well be the culprit of the whole celebration, and now Susan decided to find out something interesting. Susan had imagined it all quite differently, but it seemed she had seen her before with Marquis Kreutz. Queen Beatrice confessed that she was not sure, but that all the way to Greenfurg she looked out of the carriage window, and that was when she saw a man and a woman together who looked like the Marquis and Countess. No one even dared to argue whether this was true, and the aristocrats only began to whisper among themselves. And if you think about it, is it worth it for Beatrice to continue to delve into the depths of high society gossip? She admitted that she had heard that Prince Wilhelm was a very distinguished person, and if he were to have another child, it would certainly attract a lot of attention. One of the ladies admitted that it did not seem that His Highness was very concerned about such things, since he was concerned about something completely different, which could not be said about his close associates. The prince is already in the midst of a succession battle, and it seems that Queen Beatrice has gathered quite a lot of information for herself at this event. They say that Wilhelm took after his father, but most importantly, his beautiful face. And after that, Beatrice was asked if anything like that was happening in the kingdom of Kale, and this was the question she didn't want to hear more than anything. She had to inevitably try to get out of the water dry, so she replied that she didn't even know what to say to that question. Never-ending music, lots of drinks and desserts, witty jokes and intimate gossip, and the lives of the people present at the banquet are filled with luxury and eternal fun. The girl even became interested in how many high society scandals she would have to endure that evening. One of the ladies sitting behind her remarked that it was not a flagrant lack of manners, that the young man was not even going to apologize, and of course Beatrice wondered what had happened. The man who had just bumped into the woman simply walked away and actually pushed her, but at that moment Queen Beatrice saw a silver pendant on the floor. The thing looked expensive. This pendant must belong to him, but why did he manage to leave so quickly? The court aristocrats did not want to believe that in their time men had no manners at all, and instead, Queen Beatrice decided to apologize to the girls standing next to her and sincerely asked for forgiveness. During the entire time, she took only a couple of steps, but she was incredibly tired, and perhaps this was due to the abundance of alcohol and desserts, and the allies even felt dizzy. She needed to return the pendant to its owner as soon as possible, but when she went out into another room, she noticed that it was incredibly dark here. Looking around, she realized that this place did not look like a banquet hall at all, and it was not clear where she ended up. Probably the sudden clouding of consciousness is connected with the fact that she abruptly left the council room, and at that moment the lady even became somehow scared. But suddenly she heard a familiar voice behind her, asking if the girl had thought about his proposal from yesterday. Indeed, Prince Wilhelm was sitting near one of the columns on the street, and he seemed to be waiting for Queen Beatrice to come out of the festive hall. The face of this young man was quite sweet. One could not say that he was some kind of cruel criminal or villain. He had just tricked her, and she couldn't believe that she had fallen for such a cheap trick, and if anyone had heard him now, they would have definitely decided that they were having a love affair. The lady smiled and showed the pendant she had found, saying that Wilhelm must have dropped it and she had come to get it back. It was a very valuable thing for Wilhelm, and he almost lost it, and thanked the queen with all his heart, without any shame or conscience. The people had only known each other for a short time, and Beatrice couldn't really understand what kind of person Wilhelm was. But the prince also clearly felt a strong aura emanating from the girl, and knew that she was not just an ordinary aristocrat. She placed the pendant in his hand, and for a moment, she felt something she had not sensed before. Their eyes met despite the veil covering her face, and the young man had clearly just looked into her eyes. The lady turned away and asked the prince to be careful next time if he did not want to lose something so valuable. But suddenly he announced that Queen Beatrice had died of hemophilia 10 years ago and could not possibly attend this ball. Susan assumed that this would be the case, but she had no choice but to pretend to be Queen Beatrice. And probably from the very beginning, it was necessary to simply not pay attention to this damned pendant, and in general it was necessary not to eat or drink anything in the banquet hall. Wilhelm asked if the lady was unaware of Beatrice's death, but he certainly knew about this information and was completely confident in it. Licht was a man of his word, but did he really give her the name of a woman who was already dead and who was well known in Soviet circles? William watched her very carefully, waiting for her next move, and Lady Beatrice was now in a very dangerous position. Susan pulled herself together and continued to play her role, saying that she understood that the young man was the heir to a great power, but that he was speaking like that was very rude of him because she knew that she was not Susan now. She stated that she did not understand anything that Wilhelm wanted to hear from her, and did he really think that she looked like a walking corpse, and what's more, was not even a real queen? She declared loudly that she was now Beatrice Adenloria Kale, Queen of Kale, and it was very impolite to be familiar with people she didn't know well, talking as if they were friends. She promised to definitely tell about everything or something, and he wouldn't get away with it that easily. But at that moment, the tip of a blade touched the girl's face, and the man standing next to her rudely asked her to close her mouth. Not only had she been attacked yesterday, now she was being threatened with death, but Wilhelm asked the robber to lower his weapon. It was the same knight from the Imperial Guard whose excessive devotion to the prince was expressed in somewhat selfish behavior. But would such a fair and honest man as Wilhelm intimidate other people, especially in a place full of aristocrats? This young man's name was Cain, and he was outraged that the master was too merciful to this girl because only a day had passed since this woman forced a sword into her back. Wilhelm assured her that the queen had already made it clear that she had nothing to do with this, and if he continued to behave so disrespectfully towards her, he would get what he deserved. Susan could never have imagined that I would be treated like this here, and that she had really crossed half the world for this. Queen Beatrice said she was very dissatisfied and that she should probably return to the celebration because the hardest part was behind her, and all that was left was to finish the job. Wilhelm said that they could not leave the issue of state security unattended, and as soon as she confirmed that she was indeed Queen Beatrice, he would immediately leave her alone. The girl considered it a lie Wilhelm would not back down so easily, because last night they had sneaked into her bedroom with the aim of recruiting her. And if she agrees to prove that she really is the queen, everything that has been said before will be in vain. But the girl didn't really have any other choice, and here she wasn't clearly dictating the terms. So she said that she urgently needed to go to Licht. Keen took the girl by the hand to prevent her from leaving so quickly, because they were still going to find out the whole truth. Prince Wilhelm whispered to his girlfriend to remove her veil so that he could finally see her true face. He waited impatiently for the girl's face to become clear, and he would finally understand who she was. Suddenly he called her by the name Agrain, and that was the only name she was called by in the Triviak family. The girl's legs began to tremble violently, goosebumps ran across her body, and she could not believe how Wilhelm knew her name. It was as if he saw a ghost in front of him and said, "And what he sees is simply impossible." Susan couldn't understand what happened to Wilhelm's expression, but it was as if he had seen a real ghost. He said something about his sister and Duke Licht, and at that moment, the girl was overcome with incredible horror, because she did not understand at all what was happening now. If Licht inspires instinctive fear, now everything is happening exactly the opposite. The fear of this man seemed acquired, and it seemed that she had finally begun to understand Licht's words when he forced her not to take Wilhelm's side under any circumstances. This means that a grain is related not only to Licht's past, but also to Prince Wilhelm's past. But the chance was extremely small, and in the novel, a grain did not stand out in any way and was an ordinary secondary character. It was enough for her that Licht was hiding their true connection, but now she wasn't sure how common that name was in this novel. It was incredible. She just looked like another girl, but Wilhelm approached her and ordered her not to dare take another step. He came closer to the girl to examine her face, but at that moment he heard leisurely steps from behind. It was Duke Licht himself, and it seemed that Prince Wilhelm had been expecting his appearance for a long time. Licht said he didn't expect to find the man calling himself a prince, trying to remove the queen's veil in such a dark and quiet place. He actually caught the moment when William approached the girl and almost lifted her veil, although Queen Beatrice was against it. He approached the lady and asked her to be careful in future not to disgrace her country and not to trust strangers. Queen Beatrice continued to play the role of an aristocrat and immediately began to cry, glad that the Duke had finally appeared, and she was very scared without him. Before, she would never have believed that she felt gratitude to this man, who now appeared at the right time. But for some reason, a sudden feeling of relief came over her, and it seemed that this man had really managed to tame her. Licht held the girl tightly by the shoulder, while Cain looked in her direction, literally a couple of minutes ago, preparing to deliver a fatal blow to her with a blade. The young man wondered if Prince Wilhelm would really continue to remain silent after his unacceptable rudeness. After all, His Highness, whom Lichte knows, is completely different, but for some reason, the young man is now behaving very insolently and rudely towards the queen, and not only towards her. He asked where Prince Grünferke had gone, who valued honor and justice above all else. And now the very moment had come when Susan saw with her own eyes, and not read in a book, the tense confrontation between the Duke and the Prince. Even just reading the book, the heroine felt how inappropriate Cain was, constantly butting in everywhere, even when he shouldn't be sticking his nose in anything. Wilhelm is able, like the surface of a lake, to reflect insult and forgive. Otherwise, he would not have been able to tolerate such a person as Cain for so long. But Licht was not like that. He was not one of those who silently swallowed insults even from the highest ranks. Perhaps, but it's for the best, and so Susan feels under reliable protection, and thanks to his presence, all her fears quickly recede. But the truth is, their place is immediately taken by nerves stretched like strings, and with each passing day there are more and more tense situations. Duke Licht, covering the girl with his hand, declared that Wilhelm was ignorant and seemed not to realize his place. Moreover, he dared to touch the queen's precious body. Coming closer to him, he stated that this thing on his collar, which denoted the badge of the Imperial Guard, seemed like a mere trinket compared to his deeds. Cain assured that he was acting only in accordance with the interests of the Empire and its security. Duke Licht called him an imperial trinket and grabbed him by the throat, and at that moment he saw how the previously impudent young man was truly frightened. Holding him by the neck with a tight grip, he informed him that he would find him a more suitable reward for his insolent behavior. He cold-bloodedly promised to gouge out both of his eyes so that he could proudly display them in his room as decoration. He chuckled, no need to thank him because Licht didn't find it difficult at all. Susan considered Licht to be an incredible madman because he threatened a guard and a personal bodyguard right in front of Prince Wilhelm. Wilhelm asked the Duke to stop his cruel actions towards his guard, and this is already going beyond all bounds. He promised to apologize for his subordinate's mistake, and after these words, Licht finally let go of Cain's neck. Wilhelm stated that he really had no forgiveness, and he was very sorry that this had happened, so Cain should immediately apologize to the Duke. He uttered words of forgiveness in a hoarse voice and admitted that he was deeply guilty of this situation. At the moment, Wilhelm's power was not so great, and if he could not use his power to curb Licht or turn the situation to his advantage. So Cain looks like he's ready to sink into the ground, but next time he'll think before he grabs Queen Beatrice's hand. Licht said, shouldn't the young man apologize to the lady? Because in my opinion, Beatrice has suffered greatly here. William agreed and asked the queen for forgiveness, admitting that he could not convey in words how much he had sinned before her. The lady asked not to say such loud words because how many more unscrupulous people would try to lift her veil? The queen sighed in disappointment and made a sad face, asking Licht to leave here immediately because she had already suffered enough. Susan always supported Wilhelm in the novel The Sun Spreading in the River, She sincerely rejoiced at each of Ivan's victories and each of his new acquired ally. But now that she is on Duke Licht's side, she has to oppose him. Everyone knows that villains never defeat the main characters. And what if Susan missed her only chance to escape Licht's clutches and already seemed to regret her decision? All these questions haunted the girl, and now she seemed not to know which of them was really worth trusting. William admitted that he understood everything and had no right to ask such a thing, but could Queen Beatrice give him one more minute? Licht looked at Wilhelm with a menacing gaze, but he confirmed once again that the question was addressed to the Queen, not the Duke. Susan had absolutely no idea what else he wanted from her, since enough serious events had already happened. But since Licht is nearby, she might listen to him just out of interest. Wilhelm said that a long time ago he lost someone important to him, but many years passed after that. Even though they were not blood relatives, this girl was like a sister to him. And when he first saw her, it seemed to him that Queen Beatrice was very similar to this girl, and for sure this may sound rude, but he asked her to lift her veil at least once. In that very pendant that she returned to him, is there really a portrait of that very girl, Augrain, that he is talking about? The lady stated that she and his old acquaintance had completely different hair colors. Apparently she was the only blonde, and her hair was bright chestnut, but Wilhelm insisted that color was not that important. But Queen Beatrice could not admit that she actually had red hair, which was incredibly similar to the hair of his old friend. The young man advised that if the girl was uncomfortable, she could not lift her veil. But the Queen said that she was neither a criminal nor a person who would run and hide. Licht didn't even look in her direction, however. From the outside, he doesn't look very happy, and surely nothing bad should happen. The lady slowly lifted her veil, and she was quite satisfied with Licht, and she had no desire to get involved in Wilhelm's affairs as well. Although the name and eye color matched, the girls had different hair colors. Taking off her veil, Augrain tried to act confident and not show that she was incredibly scared. She looked into Wilhelm's eyes and asked him not to keep her in suspense, so long as he didn't look for her specifically, and she really wanted his face to instantly take on a disappointed expression. But Wilhelm continued to look attentively at the girl, and it was as if he really saw in her a person close to him. She continued to stand with her veil lifted and asked him whether he was looking for similarities with his friend, or whether there were none at all. Whether it was the joy of meeting the one he had been looking for so long, or the disappointment of never finding the one, his face remained impassive, as if a boring performance was being staged in front of him. But the heroine could not understand one thing: why Wilhelm's gaze was now so insistent. The lady confessed that, to tell the truth, Wilhelm was the first person to whom she showed her face, not counting the Duke. She still felt the same anxiety and fear, but it was different from what Licht evoked in her, more like a feeling of opening up to her sworn enemy. She looked down sadly and asked the Queen if she didn't mind if she could answer a few more questions. Beatrice objected, but the young man asked to give her his hand, and this would be his last request towards her. He tried to touch the girl's hand, but she was overcome with fear and intense horror, as if she could not allow him to touch her. Beatrice was not afraid of Wilhelm, and it was not him who frightened her, but the situation itself and her behavior in it. In her mind, she asked the Duke to tell Wilhelm to stop immediately, because her nerves were also on edge. She incredibly wanted to leave here as soon as possible, never return here again, and not meet Prince Wilhelm. The Duke took her hand firmly, and Queen Beatrice clung to his hand with all her might, completely mad with fear. The young man asked sweet Beatrice to calm down, and it seems Prince Wilhelm simply feels an inexplicable attraction to her. The Duke asked the girl to understand that he did not want to keep her like a bird in a cage, and that she could make her own decision. And does the Duke want her to do as Prince William wants? And after that, the lady confidently extended her hand to him. The lady asked if the young man was pleased, but the prince remained standing silently and looking at her face. She continued to stand with her hand outstretched, while Wilhelm carefully watched her every movement and her facial expression. Wilhelm apologized again, and not knowing that the lady would be against it, he sincerely asked her to accept his apology, promising that the girls would no longer have to step over themselves and act against their will. All this time, Queen Beatrice silently carried out the instructions of the Duke and William, but she herself did not understand at all what was happening here. Everyone here was saying that they couldn't read her mind, and in any case, Beatrice had no idea what Prince Wilhelm was talking about, but she thanked him for his concern. She asked if they were still talking about the same thing, but Wilhelm only smiled sweetly and said nothing. It was his smile that completely confused the girl, and it was unclear what was on the strange young man's mind. Prince Wilhelm slowly turned around and promised Queen Beatrice that they would definitely see each other soon, but Beatrice apologized and refused, because tomorrow she was returning to Ingord to her everyday life as a servant of the Union. Finally, he said a few words which made Lady Susan start and stop where she was. He said that her close friend had said that she missed her very much, and that the girl should visit her sometime. The young man assured her that she would welcome the girl with open arms, and that she would probably also miss her incredibly. She didn't understand what close friend they were talking about, or moreover, whether she was also acquainted with Wilhelm, and what if he had deliberately given the girl a hint that this was that same Reyna. Reyna hadn't betrayed her or lied to her, and when she helped her escape from the Duke, the maid meant every word she said. This means that Wilhelm knows everything about Susan and her current situation. But now she was in the form of Queen Beatrice, and even if he knew what she looked like, she looked completely different now. And perhaps her true identity was given away by her green emerald eyes, which are unlikely to be confused with any others. Susan felt like a real silly lady because all this time her attention was riveted on Wilhelm. But Duke Licht was still standing next to her, and she simply had to say something. The lady confessed that she would under no circumstances seek a meeting with Prince William, and it looked as if she was making excuses. She once again promised Wilhelm that she would never get involved with the young man, but even she seemed to not believe in the sincerity of her words. And the reason was not that she would be afraid of being abandoned. The reason was that while she was next to him, she constantly had to prove her loyalty, because Licht Ingord did not leave traitors alive. They walked along the dark corridor of the castle, and Licht asked if the girl had forgotten about their bet, which she herself had agreed to. That night he asked her to make a deal, and at that moment the lady was very scared, and was ready to do anything just to stay alive. They then made a bet whether Wilhelm could or could not completely tame her, and if she won, he would tell her the whole truth. And now Susan was completely beside herself with misunderstanding, because everything that had happened before turned out to be a terrible lie. The moment he demanded to give her hand to the prince, she obeyed, and he obligingly reminded her of what she had managed to forget, because any lady can only dream of such a gentleman as he. Licht asked not to provoke the girl with inappropriate flirting, but the lady sternly declared that Licht was the main provocateur. Susan didn't know why she was overcome with intense anger, and she involuntarily took out on Licht all the fear and confusion she felt because of Wilhelm. That was why Susan had lost her temper, and she just needed to admit it. But suddenly other aristocrats appeared next to them, causing a lot of noise and hubbub. As soon as they found themselves in the company of aristocrats, Licht embraced Queen Beatrice with an affectionate gesture. He asked if the girl felt this way only because of the prince, and at that moment he spoke the words in the most tender and affectionate tone. Licht smiled and said that the girl got excited out of nowhere, but in reality absolutely nothing happened. But now he is near again, and she can moderate her ardor, and now the heroine finally understands that all this is just a skillfully thought-out game. They went into the formal dining hall, and Licht asked the queen because compared to her, he knew absolutely nothing about Soviet affairs. Susan couldn't understand how she could be the equal of a man who had just promised to gouge out another man's eyes. And it was as if there were two completely different people inside the Duke. He may act sensually, as if he will never let go, but at the same time there is a sense of calculation in all his actions. The young man said that Beatrice probably guessed what he was thinking about now, and that everything was very simple. He took her hand and confessed that she could consider that both sides of his personality loved her, if that would make her feel better. He gently took her hand, and from this touch, goosebumps ran down the girl's back, but for some reason it became warm inside. When Susan approached Birknay, she asked that she did not understand what exactly His Excellency wanted from her. She racked her brains for a long time, but came to nothing at times. His Excellency's gaze was so frightening that her knees cramped with horror. And sometimes he is gentle, like a true gentleman, but at the same time unbearably cruel, and it can be very difficult to keep up with his mood swings. Birknay understood perfectly well what the girl meant, because he had known the Duke for a very long time. But it seems she did well and managed to get used to life here, together with the strange Duke. She spoke as if she were about to set off on a long journey, but she knew the gentleman was mad. The Duke's mania is a divine blessing. It is what led to the lands of Ingord being so infinitely wide. The whole world recognizes this, and the lady wondered why Birknay decided to tell her this now. Since Susan had come to live here, His Excellency's mania had considerably abated, and the young man was very grateful to the girl for this, and he very much hoped that in time she would be able to feel much calmer here. As unpleasant as it was to admit, the Duke was right about something. And Licht Ingord was the main villain of this world, and all she could think about was how to escape from him as quickly as possible. While the ceremony was going on, the Duke did not let Queen Beatrice go for a minute. But at that moment, Keen approached him and told him the terrible news in horror. He approached the Duke and reported that a terrible event had happened to Marquis Croix. Keen was silent for a couple of seconds, but then confessed that the master was dead, and Queen Beatrice, hearing this, stopped breathing altogether and seemed to turn to stone on the spot. The first question that came to her mind was whether the Marquis's death had already been predetermined by someone. But she knew for sure that he wasn't supposed to die in the next 3 years, and now the plot was diverging greatly from the original story. Absolutely no one could change the course of events in this world. Licht would have dealt with the time traveler before he could do anything. But nevertheless, Marquis Kreutz is no longer among the living. And if the plot of the story was now changing instantly, Susan had no idea what would happen to her next. After the festive event, she stayed overnight in the bedroom, and that day turned out to be too difficult for her mentally. It was the first time she had fallen into such a deep sleep since she had taken the Ingard poison, and for a moment she felt as if she had died and then woken up. The girl tried to pull herself together and gather her thoughts together because the girl still had something to do. She slowly repeated that she was the 22nd Queen Beatrice of the Kingdom of Kale, a 19-year-old girl who had been removed from the race for the throne when her mother was overthrown. The point of no return had already been passed, and she went to the Duke personally. But even if he was sleeping, she was obliged to wake him up if Licht was extremely displeased. Because now she still really wanted to see his face, even if it was distorted with indignation, because in some sense it would even be good if he was dissatisfied. She tried to remember where the Duke's room was, but when she went out into the corridor, she had absolutely no idea where she was. At first it seemed to her as if she was going up or down the stairs, but if she went outside, she would be able to visually determine what floor she was on. Once out in the fresh air, the girl's consciousness cleared up a little, and since there was probably no one there, she decided to take off her veil for a while. But as soon as she raised hers, a young man entered the balcony and asked if it was that same Susan standing right in front of him. This young man turned out to be Viscount Semble, whom the lady must surely remember. He asked why the lady was wearing that dress and veil, and indeed, they had not exchanged greetings at the banquet. He continued to look closely at her face, confident that Susan herself was standing in front of him. Susan didn't know what to do. He obviously recognized her face, and she couldn't just turn around and leave. And this chance meeting could ruin all her plans. The young man admitted that he did not expect to meet the girl again here, and was extremely looking forward to their meeting, because he never received a response to his letter. The lady knew that if she immediately lowered her veil back, it would seem even more suspicious. The young man wanted to know a few questions, promising that he could keep his mouth shut no worse than the Duke. The girl's dress seemed light to the young gentleman, but at that moment she took him by the hand and unexpectedly led him to the edge of the balcony. The lady asked Semble not to push her away under any circumstances and pressed her whole body against him. She stated that she came here only to meet him, and absolutely no one else could know about this. Susan had no choice but to kiss the young man right there on the cold balcony so that he completely forgot about all the questions he wanted to ask. The girl continued to kiss him hard so that Semble's mind would become clouded as quickly as possible, and he would completely forget why he came here. The lady had a strange feeling as if hordes of insects were running all over her body, but she tried not to pay attention to her feelings. She mentally asked him not to think about anything and to free his head from unwanted thoughts, because everything would end as soon as the Viscount swallowed her saliva. The guy noticed that the lady bit her lip slightly, and a small drop of blood was visible on her lips. The young man grabbed his throat because he found it very difficult to breathe, and he thought that he had the blood of the devil in him. Susan calmly watched the reaction of the young gentleman, who was still convulsively clutching his throat and could not breathe. She saw clearly how the young man was suffocating and suffering, and this was not surprising. She could only give him 1 or 2 drops of her blood, although they should have been enough to burn everything in her mouth and corrode her throat, but before she would have shuddered at the mere sight. But now she calmly watched his suffering. Susan seemed not to be troubled by her conscience at all, and she told the Viscount that she was not at all the one he thought she was. The lady was sure that her name had been announced at the banquet, but she could not believe that the young master dared to propose such a thing to her. After all they know about each other is just their names, and yet the young man was tactless enough to invite Queen Beatrice into his room. The young gentleman continued to writhe in pain, and the lady, without thinking, pushed him off the balcony at that moment. She watched him slowly fall down, certain that the young man had behaved in an extremely rude manner towards Queen Beatrice. She watched with a cold gaze as he slowly choked, but not a single emotion moved in her veins. The dense foliage made it difficult for her to see, but she did not hear anyone calling for help. The second time is always easier than the first, which means that the third time will be even easier. She remained standing on the 3rd floor, and the lady had to go up 1 more floor to get to the Duke. The lady thought that she could get used to this, not paying attention to the pain of other people, although she could not shake off this feeling, as if everything was happening unrealistically. But to her great surprise, turning around, she saw the figure of a young man standing in the distance, but she was sure that she was here alone. Much to her disappointment, it was Prince Wilhelm, who seemed to have been watching the girl do what she had done the whole time. She didn't want to think about how long he had been standing there, or whether she had seen the young man thrown off the balcony with her own hands. It's hard to tell whether he saw everything or not, but it's completely unclear from his eyes what he was thinking. Susan couldn't help but think of a better way to get out of Wilhelm's sight and run as fast as she could. She ran barefoot along the cold floor of the dark corridor, her heart pounding wildly. She hadn't been able to do anything since she came here, and she really wanted the next few days to be calmer. She thought her bad luck ended the day she met Duke Licht, but it seems fate has even more interesting challenges in store for her. Viscount Semble fell from the 3rd floor, and Prince Wilhelm was a witness to it. Besides, Semble is quite close to Licht's entourage, but she was sure that she did what she had to. She finally reached the Duke's door, and wanted only to see Licht as soon as possible, even if only for a moment. And right now she wanted to confess to him all the mistakes she had made, and could no longer bear this heavy burden. Perhaps then the headache and all-consuming disappointment would leave her, but upon entering the Duke's room, she was completely speechless. There was a girl in a black robe with long blonde hair standing in his office, and Susan didn't immediately realize who it was. She silently opened the door, and the lady in the long black dress silently looked in her direction, and it seemed that they were very similar in appearance. Susan, entering the office, realized that she had been completely wrong about everything, and now she really wanted to know what was really going on here. The lady smiled and asked if the Duke was having some very important and serious conversation. She looked at Susan as if she were an uninvited guest, but there was nothing strange about it, since she was introduced to everyone as Queen Beatrice. If you looked closely, this girl looked suspiciously familiar, and Susan tried to remember who she was. Golden blonde, fair skin, and a graceful and proud posture, this lady clearly looked like a famous aristocrat. Having looked closely at her appearance, it seemed that the Union remembered that this was the same daughter of the Marquis of Kreutz, who had recently been visiting the Duke's outbuilding, Ariel Kreutz. She suddenly announced that she was expecting a child from Duke Licht, and Susan never expected to hear such news. It was true the Duke had not misheard, and the lady was going to announce this information tomorrow morning in front of the entire Soviet society. Susan couldn't contain her emotions and chuckled softly, and at that moment she caught the Marquise's suspicious gaze. Queen Beatrice said it sounded incredibly funny, but she asked the ladies to not behave so frivolously. Susan asked for forgiveness, but she knew how her words could be taken seriously. Since when did she start expecting a child, and even from Duke Licht, and what could be funnier than this incredible nonsense? This man's entire body is saturated with pure poison, and even if they really had something serious, her insides would have been burned through long ago. She is so confident because the aristocracy does not know about this, and can quite calmly recall the time when she lived in the Duke's wing. But even if she is not pregnant, it is quite possible that they actually have a special relationship. True, Duke Licht was far from the last man in the empire, and he had an incredibly large number of women. But for some reason, Susan didn't care. But in any case, she remained just a dog who loyally obeyed her master. Licht said that as soon as he finished talking with the Marquise, he would definitely come to her. But for now, it would be better for her to return back to her room. And if possible, he would not want to show the girl his dark side, which she knows absolutely nothing about. The Marquise was surprised that His Excellency really wanted to visit this woman tonight. She looked at Queen Beatrice with contempt and anger, declaring that it was she who was to blame for everything that had happened. The lady called the Union a cunning witch who ruined her whole life and the life of her unborn child. The king grabbed the Marquise by the hand, and the Marquise of Kreutz screamed loudly for Duke Licht to come to her aid immediately. She was indignant. Was the Duke really going to give everything to some provincial woman, and the medicine that was intended for her would go to the main villain? She screamed that because of this girl she had lost everything she had dreamed of, and most importantly, she had lost Ingord's poison. But more accurately, it was Licht's diluted blood that she was talking about. And in fact, all this time she wanted to get poison from him. He poisoned her body to get his way, and she threw away all her pride and begged like some little dog. Now Susan understood clearly, because the Duke had treated her in exactly the same way. The Marchioness claimed that everything indicated that the child had been conceived during her stay in the outbuilding, and that her brother, who was about to take over his father's title, wanted to gain independence from Prince Wilhelm. The Duke had no intention of uniting with the Kreutz family, and it was a pity that it was the Marquise who was in question. The young man coldly stated that his daughter's penchant for men ultimately brought her father to the grave, and the child's father must be Triviascha, so the Duke will never know about it. The Duke said that every summer night she tirelessly came to his bedroom, but apparently she had a very passionate love before him. After all, he never reciprocated her feelings, and the girl was unable to carry out her plans, so the lady screamed that Duke Licht was a real killer. Marquise Kreutz should not have died, and did not deserve to die like that, and should not have burned alive in his own house. She cried and said that they had vowed to spend their whole lives next to each other, and their love was pure and sincere. But the Duke found it very amusing to hear this from the lips of the Marquis's daughter, because she knew who her father was and what he had actually been doing all his life. The lady lay on the cold floor in the Duke's office, hysterical, crying loudly, and not understanding how this could have happened, since the gentleman was no longer there. He was gone, and the girl needed medicine, and Susan could not watch the excruciating suffering of a lady unknown to her. Now the Marquise was at the very bottom, and it was impossible to imagine a person falling even lower. And even seeing the corpse of Viscount Semble, who had fallen from the third floor, was not as disgusting as watching the suffering of the Marquise, who had killed the Croesus herself. The lady looked at the Duke with eyes full of tears, understanding that it was this man who had destroyed her whole life, and she no longer had a single chance. Such devotion deserved a certain reward, and he dropped the test tube of scarlet blood from his hand right in front of the Marquise's face. At that moment, she looked distraught, and seeing the treasured test tube, she crawled up to it and grabbed the glass, thanking the Duke. She thanked the gentleman and happily took the test tube with his blood as if it was the only thing she needed. Susan understood that everything happened as she thought, and Duke Ingord solves things in a cruel way. And one day this cute-looking young man will subjugate an entire huge empire to his will. The Duke asked Kino to escort Ariel to her chambers, and the young man obediently prepared to carry out his order. Ariel still promised to tell all the aristocrats tomorrow that she was expecting a child from the Duke, and Licht was surprised why people continued to insist on their own. And does she really think that the child will survive in her womb if it really is Duke Licht's? This cannot be, but the young man asked to take Ariel away, but the girl prayed to say that she had misunderstood the master and that he would not kill her child. Keen led the Marchioness out of the room, leaving Susan standing alone in his office with the Duke. After this terrible scene, the girl could not come to her senses, and her feelings seemed to have completely disappeared from the ruthlessness of the young master. Licht asked the lady to come to him, and Susan cautiously walked towards him. Susan guessed why Ariel was terrified, but the Duke himself gave her that medicine of his. But his words, even when she was forcibly taken from here, she clutched that bottle so tightly in her hands, as if it was her only treasure. Probably, if Susan had arrived a couple of minutes earlier, she would not have seen all this, and now she just wanted to get out of here as quickly as possible. She confessed that Viscount Semble had learned this evening that she was Susan's servant. The lady said she pushed him from the 3rd floor, and Prince Wilhelm, and it was definitely him. Because after what happened, she clearly saw the figure of the prince standing on the neighboring balcony. This means that his body will be found soon, and the security inside and outside the mansion is incredibly tight. But for some reason, the Duke didn't even ask the lady anything, because she had put him in danger due to her carelessness. Moreover, his political opponent found out about it. He was so heartless towards Ariel, but not so heartless towards Susan, and she decided to ask if it was true that the child was not his. She asked too directly, and now she was afraid that the Duke would do the same to her as he did to Ariel. But now she wanted to hear a negative answer. The lady wanted to hear what made anything special to him, and the Duke chuckled at how she could even ask him such a truly stupid question. And the only one who can trust him with her body and still remain safe and sound is she, and anyone else in her place would immediately die in unbearable agony. Susan herself had assumed this, but she wanted to hear the young gentleman's opinion, which turned out to be that the girl did not believe him at all. If she wants it so much, he can prove it right here and now, leaving the girl with no doubts. Susan sternly stated that the young man was using women for his own interests, and it was these words that Ariel trusted at the time. But she probably shouldn't have said that, and now the maid had spoken extremely unflatteringly about the master, but what had been said could not be undone. Licht whispered that it meant the girl needed it, since she gave free rein to her emotions. He slowly lifted her veil and asked why Susan had such a strange face. It's as if the young man has a feeling that he should apologize to her right here and now. Licht had never apologized to anyone, and his words seemed incredibly strange to the lady. Until now, she had only seen a smirk, contempt, or weariness on his face, but it seemed that just a few moments ago something else had happened. She felt something alive in his expression, as if the Duke were still a living person. He insisted that the lady was forcing him to justify himself, but she herself did not say a word. And she always wanted to ask Duke Licht so many questions, and one day he called her a demoness who dragged him into real hell, and this question also worried the girl. He also mentioned that their meeting was not just a coincidence, and the heroine did not understand what she really meant to him, because according to him, he knew her better than himself, and how much he really knows about her. The lady asked if the gentleman really hated her so much, and if it was time for him to tell the truth about her. He probably had no intention of answering her question, but Susan still really wanted to ask him. An ordinary person cannot forget another for only 2 reasons: either he loves him madly, or he hates him madly. Although it seems there is a 3rd reason, it is a combination of these 2 reasons, and the lady thought about it for the first time only now. Perhaps subconsciously, she too will never be able to forget Licht for one of these reasons. Among all the possible reasons, she chose hatred, excluding love, and Susan, unable to contain her emotions, asked if the young man really loved her so madly. The lady was very worried, or rather afraid, that the Duke really hated her. Licht repeated the same words again, and if he tamed the girl, then she would lose the bet. But there is just one thing she might have missed. Love is just a sandcastle in the face of time, but pain and hatred are like a castle that can never be melted. You can't just forget about them, because the ice only gets stronger with time. Like a brand that could not be erased, this was what made the Duke feel like himself. Licht stroked the girl's hair, but he said all this as if not to her, but to someone else. He said this to the girl hidden in the depths of her mind, whom she never knew and never saw, and it was she who left an indelible mark on his soul that remained with him for the rest of his life. The young man whispered to the lady if she wanted to know if he really hated her, and to her regret, she guessed right. According to him, because of her, he fell so low that he still can't go, and she made him regret it for the rest of his life, and at the same time gave her the strength to never give up for anything. Susan felt it was a blatant lie, his look, his touch. She felt the falseness in everything, because she could not do anything like that. He admitted that if the lady was interested, she could try to find out for herself and make an effort, and perhaps it would bear fruit, but for the union it was incredibly mean and dishonest. There is little honesty in this world, and the gentleman knew this better than anyone else, gently stroking the girl's face. And now, Susan had absolutely no idea who she was really dealing with, and whether there was any truth in the words of this man who was playing with her like a doll. She was literally tied hand and foot and could not escape from her confinement. And for all this, she hated the young master. But he only grinned and said that he was glad to hear it. Susan screamed, "You can't say that, because that's definitely not what the gentleman wants, and he must answer her honestly." In Berkney's case, she simply stood her ground until the very end, and he eventually gave in, so finding out the truth from either of them would have been easy. But it was impossible to find out the truth from Licht. His blue eyes were always piercing and dark, like a surface of water, the depth of which cannot be measured. With each passing minute, this frightened Susan more and more. Licht hugged her, touched the lady's hair with his gentle hands, and asked Susan not to worry under any circumstances. And at that moment she found herself remembering, as if in reality, he had once held her so carefully by the neck, and the feeling of déjà vu, as if all this had already happened, did not leave, and was terribly confusing. Licht confessed so that the girl would not worry, because his hatred until his death would be directed only at her. And someday they will meet again, because wherever they are still destined to be close. And someday, not on the pages of a book, but in real life, he will again be able to gain power over her. After meeting the Duke, the lady fell exhausted onto her bed, and it was as if her life had changed that evening. The foundation ended up in her room, and she and Licht talked until late at night, but she didn't remember anything, and wondered if it had something to do with the headache. A maid entered the room and asked if the Honorable Queen Beatrice was awake, bringing her morning breakfast on a gilded tray and informing her that the carriage was ready. Despite his promise to catch the murderer on the spot, the new Marquis opened the gates of the mansion at dawn, and as soon as the way was clear, the entire aristocracy poured into the street in a single stream, and the Ingard's carriage was no exception. Only a few relatives remained to mourn the death of the deceased, while everyone else tried to get away from this place as quickly as possible. This is because the death of Marcus Kreutz was ruled a suicide, and no one else was involved in it except him. The coachman said that they would soon be at the border of Malta, and if the Duke needed anything, he could send the servants ahead. Queen Beatrice admitted that Licht had dozed off a bit, so it was simply necessary to continue on to Ingard. But she wasn't sure whether he had truly dozed off or was just pretending to be asleep. As they crossed the city, Licht kept his eyes closed, and the lady watched him closely the whole time. He seemed to want to go to the banquet together, however. He does not seem to be satisfied with Queen Beatrice. Now, Susan was completely unclear what the Duke really expected of her, and whether she had any role at all in this false performance. Looking out the window, she saw a young man riding a fast horse near the carriage. She thought it was Knight Kreutz, and he asked to stop the carriage to give something to Her Majesty. The knight asked for forgiveness, and Queen Beatrice opened the door, and indeed, he wanted to tell her something. He handed her a strange object wrapped in burgundy velvet fabric, and said that he had been ordered to give it to Queen Beatrice. Despite the noise, the Duke never opened his eyes, and even if he really was asleep, she was still sure that he was aware of what was happening because his senses were always on alert. She unfolded the velvet cloth and saw a red box with gilded patterns, deciding to take a look at what was inside. This gift could have been sent personally to the duchy, but when she opened the box, she saw the pendant that Prince Wilhelm had dropped, and there was a note lying nearby. There was a short inscription on it, "To my beloved sister, Agraith Carold," and a couple more lines about how the young man had thought for a long time and decided that the lady would someday need his help. He signed that he very much hoped they would see each other soon, and the letter was written in the hand of Prince Wilhelm himself. Susan, frightened, immediately closed the box so that the Duke would not have time to read or see anything. Now she understood that everything was on the surface, and only the most stupid would not guess anything. The girl that Wilhelm had been looking for so long was his cousin, and literally everything about their appearance matched: the shade of their hair, the color of their eyes, and even their name. It turned out that Agrain Carol was the owner of this body, and she really was Prince Wilhelm's sister. Carold was a noble family of founders, which not only is not inferior to them in the city, but also competes with it in terms of influence on the people of the empire. But over time, the number of Carol's descendants dwindled, and the family's top priority became longevity rather than prosperity. For some unknown reason, the Carold family once fell into decline, and no one could find the true reasons for this tragedy. Even when the imperial family personally nominated a new successor to the line, no one from the king's sideline interfered, and is it known that shortly before the birth of the line, all their descendants suffered from a terrible mania. It was an inglorious end for the great Carold family, which eventually lost its reputation altogether, and as it turned out, The owner of this body, Agrain, is a scion of this noble family, which Wilhelm had been trying to find for a long time. Having attended such a grand event, Susan really learned something new that she did not know before. The founding line and the mysterious magic, the Carold and Ingord lineages, are somehow connected to each other, and it is unlikely that this is a simple coincidence. And surely the magic that Birknay mentioned is connected to something that she doesn't even know about. Susan returned to her usual work as a servant, but suddenly the statuette fell from her hands, and the maid standing nearby asked if everything was okay with the girl. Lena was afraid for a second that the lady might lose consciousness again because this had happened before. Lena was worried that the girl didn't think about herself at all and looked even worse than she had before, and she simply couldn't watch how the lady was exhausting herself. It must have been because of her father's death, so Lena suggested taking at least a day off from work because she wasn't the only one who noticed that Susan was completely exhausted. Susan had to lie about her father dying because no other excuse would have helped in this situation. She had to somehow explain her long absence without revealing the identity of Queen Beatrice. In fact, she didn't even know her father, but she had to lie about his death while she was absent from the ball. After returning to Ingord, Susan regained her peace of mind, no longer having to dye her hair to keep it blonde, nor did she have to cover her face with a veil or constantly be aware of her surroundings. In truth, she had damaged her hair a lot from heat styling and bleaching, but not to the point where it was completely beyond repair. Everything returned to normal, and the girl asked Lena if she had ever heard of Ingord's mania. She warned the maid that she might not answer if it might cause her any trouble, since she herself had only recently heard about it and knew absolutely nothing. Rumor has it that cursed blood flows through his veins. Apparently this is true, and now Lena even wants to tell the Duke's ordinary servant that he is not all right in the head. She thought it was some kind of family curse, but she didn't understand how this could even be possible. Even Susan couldn't understand, and maybe she was cursed too. Well, where did you see ordinary people getting inside a novel? Lena had already heard similar information about other maids, so she knew no more than the others. Time passed slowly, and the feeling that Susan was trapped here only grew deeper inside her. Perhaps her fate is doomed, and she will be forced to remain in this affair until the very end of her days, with no chance to change anything. She looked out the window and couldn't believe that autumn had already arrived, and the leaves on the trees were turning bright yellow and red. 2 months had passed since they had returned from the Marquise's mansion, but her life had not changed and remained the same, except that she began to perceive herself a little differently. The reason why Wilhelm's pendant ended up in her hands was clear as day, and it was not for nothing that he dropped it on the floor at that party. It was as if he was saying that Agrain had existed in this world before, and she had not, but unlike her, she had no knowledge of her past at all. Susan didn't know if she was mistaken when she thought that she could live her own life in the body of a stranger and not be touched by the past life of Wilhelm's sister. If she continues to remain in someone else's body and bear the name Agrain, her fate will probably turn out differently. Was there anything in this world that she could call her own? Because now everything here was alien to her. After all, even Licht's hatred is entirely hers, and it's unlikely that anyone before her has ever suffered such a fate. She returned to the maids, and the head lady asked how Susan was feeling. She laughed. If only she could see herself in the mirror. Because anyone would be scared for her when they looked at her pale face, I and everyone who saw Suzanne immediately asked about her health. Meanwhile, Madame herself had also become sagging in the last few days, and she and I looked quite sad. The maid told me that an autumn banquet was being held in Ingord, and all the nobility from the nearby lands were invited to establish new connections. It was no wonder why they both looked so tired lately. But as the maid admitted, it was the imperial will. But no one knew that the Duke liked to arrange such meetings. And hadn't Susan heard that the Emperor was eagerly awaiting the Duke's wedding, and that his banquet would also be held in Ingord for the 5th time this year? The purpose of this banquet was only to hasten Licht's marriage, for which the Emperor was probably responsible. The lady became curious about how Licht would behave towards his beloved woman, and she could not imagine who would dare to become the Duke's wife. Would he really start to whisper words of love to her tenderly, looking at her affectionately and holding her gently by the waist, just like he had done with her recently at the festive ball, looking into her sincere eyes through a dark veil? These thoughts even made Susan feel better, because she knew very well what kind of person the Duke really was. The whole world thinks that the imperial family and Ingord are enemies. But this is not so, on the contrary. They trust the Duke so much that they can't wait to meet him again. Susan smiled and said that it seemed like the maids would have a lot of work to do these days, and it was necessary to get everything done before the event began. As much as she wanted to find out everything as soon as possible, there was no point in rushing things, because she would not find out what kind of relationship she had with Igraine before the appointed time. Suddenly, the maid confessed that it was about the young man from the bookstore, and it seemed that he was incredibly in love with the young maid. She reminded me of that guy with freckles on his face. And if you walk down the street to the Duke's mansion, you could reach the shopping arcade and find him there. In the house, deep in the alley between the boulevards, on the ground floor there is a bookshop, and it was this address that Wilhelm wrote on the back of the letter. Madame Colento insisted that she had a keen eye, and at her age it was hard not to notice, because when it came to Susan, he always looked away in embarrassment. At that moment, the door opened, and Birkny entered, and again he called the lady, without saying a word about where they were going. Susan already knew they were going to Licht's office, but Birkny was especially silent this time. Just as Susan was about to ask one question, the young man turned around and asked if she had asked this question 1,000 times already. And he didn't know what she had heard at the banquet at Kreutz's. But he repeated that he had absolutely nothing to say about it. Susan said she had no intention of asking about anything, but the young man insisted that she had been asking about it ever since she returned from the celebratory banquet. But suddenly she asked Birkny whether Duke Licht would really find a worthy wife for himself, whom he would love. For him, this was as natural as the sun rising in the east and setting in the west. And Susan really understood that she had asked the most stupid questions, and it was impossible to imagine that such an influential man would be left without a wife. But the whole problem is that he is literally poisonous, and from the outside it looks like he is one of those men who think that having a mistress is a waste of energy because he cannot leave an heir. Birkny was extremely interested in why the lady doubted, in fact. She herself had no objective reasons for this. She just couldn't imagine it unless someone came along that he truly loved with all his heart. Licht confessed to the girl that he would hate her until the end of his days, but does this mean that he will also be able to devote all his love to another woman? Nothing is impossible, but still, for Susan it seemed unfair and very strange. In high society, marrying to cement a union is almost a duty, so the Duke has no choice but to find a suitable wife, a little later. But it will happen anyway. Now Susan had a better understanding of what was going on, but it was likely that Birkny had only said what she wanted to hear. He quietly said that they should not be misled by the fact that His Excellency considered them special, since arrogance was not the same as Ingord's poison. It consumes without a trace and eventually destroys the personality, erasing all memory and feelings that this body has ever experienced. Susan thought. It was as if Birkny wanted her to understand the topic in more detail before asking questions, and most likely the matter was completely different. And if the lady was not mistaken, the young man himself wanted to believe it, and was not trying to convince her. He admitted that Susan was an extremely smart girl, so he wasn't worried about her, and she could perceive his words as ordinary whining. As they approached the Duke's office, they paused for a moment and looked into each other's eyes, hoping that each of them understood what they were saying. The lady apologized to the young gentleman and said that she was not very smart and could hardly understand what was being discussed. And is it possible to confess only because she is treated as a special dog that will be obliged to serve until the end of her days? Susan walked into the Duke's office with a calm and peaceful face, slowly approaching his desk. While engaged in important imperial affairs, the Duke sat at his table, and warm rays of light penetrated through his windows. This appearance was already familiar to her, and the young man looked exactly the same as before the terrible incidents at the festive ball. Unhealthy, pale skin, inscrutable gray-blue eyes, a proudly raised chin, and a respectable, majestic pose. But how much time has passed since then? Because Licht doesn't suspect anything. He doesn't even realize that he is the cause of all her headaches. But he just sits and watches her wander around in search of answers. And with each passing day, the lady feels more and more like a puppet in his hands, who no longer has the right or chance to live her own life. Suddenly, Licht raised his head and said that lately they seemed to be seeing the sweet lady less often, or it only seemed that way to him, And at that moment, the human heroine completely stopped understanding what was being discussed and what this mysterious man was hiding.